Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It all started with a simple request. My neighbor, Mr. Davis, asked for help with some repairs in his house. We weren't exactly friends, but we had exchanged pleasantries over the years. He was an older man, reclusive, and his house always seemed to have an air of mystery about it. A few times, I had noticed strange noises coming from his property, but I never paid them much mind. After all, everyone has their quirks. One chilly autumn evening, he knocked on my door. His face was pale, his eyes tired, as though he hadn't slept for days. "Could you help me out with a bit of work in the basement?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just need someone strong enough to move a few things." I hesitated. I'd never been down to his basement before. I had always assumed it was cluttered, like most basements, filled with boxes and old furniture. But there was something about his tone that made me uneasy. It wasn't like him to ask for help. "Sure," I said, trying to mask the unease creeping up my spine. "I can come over tomorrow." He nodded, and with a quick glance over his shoulder, he hurried back into his house, the door closing softly behind him. The next day, I arrived at his house. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood, and the sky above was overcast, casting an eerie light across the street. Mr. Davis greeted me at the door, looking even more strained than before. He didn't say much, just led me inside and down the narrow staircase to the basement. The basement was dimly lit, the only source of light coming from a flickering bulb overhead. Dust hung in the air, and the smell of mildew was overpowering. Old furniture and boxes were scattered about, but what caught my attention was the door at the far end of the room. It was old, wooden, and locked. "Don't go near that door," Mr. Davis said, his voice sharp, almost too urgent. "Whatever you do, don't touch it." I turned to look at him, my curiosity piqued. He was standing a little too still, as though the mere mention of the door had made him freeze. I noticed a faint tremor in his hands. His eyes darted between the door and me, and for the first time, I saw fear in his gaze. "Why?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though a chill ran down my spine. "It's better if you don't know," he replied, his voice trembling slightly. Just help me with the other things, please." I nodded, though something about the locked door disturbed me. It seemed out of place, like it didn't belong in this house at all. But Mr. Davis was insistent. I turned my attention to the rest of the basement, helping him move boxes and old furniture. But my mind kept wandering back to that door. What was behind it? Why did he care so much about me staying away? As the hours passed, the atmosphere in the basement grew heavier, and the air seemed to thicken around me. Every time I glanced at that door, I felt a strange pull, as though something on the other side was calling me. Later that evening, after Mr. Davis had gone to bed, I found myself standing in front of that door. I knew I shouldn't, but my curiosity had taken hold. The lock was old, rusted, but it would only take a few moments to break it open. I glanced over my shoulder, making sure he hadn't returned, and with a deep breath, I grabbed a nearby crowbar. As I pried at the lock, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a mistake. But it was too late to turn back now. The lock gave way with a loud snap. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that led even deeper into the earth. I stepped forward, heart racing. Something told me I had just crossed a line, one that would change everything. The air grew colder as I stepped into the narrow stairwell, the damp smell of earth filling my nostrils. The light from the basement flickered above me, casting eerie shadows along the walls. Each step I took felt heavier, as if the house itself was pushing back against my intrusion. The staircase descended further than I expected, and the further I went, the darker it became. The flickering light from above barely reached this part of the basement. I strained my eyes, but all I could see was the faint outline of the stone walls and the creaking of the wooden steps underfoot. Suddenly, the stillness was broken by a faint sound, a low, almost imperceptible whisper. It sent a shiver down my spine. I stopped, listening intently. But the whispering stopped as suddenly as it had started. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling, the wind passing through the cracks in the walls. But then, I heard it again. This time, clearer. A voice. Soft, breathy, and unmistakably coming from below. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The voice sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. It was almost as if it was calling my name. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. This was wrong. Everything in me screamed to turn around, to climb back up those stairs and lock the door, but something kept me moving forward. The staircase finally opened into a small, cramped room. The air was thick with dust, and the only sound was the faint hum of the old light bulb above. The walls of the room were covered in strange markings, symbols I didn't recognize, scrawled hastily in what looked like charcoal. My heart pounded louder, each beat echoing in the silence around me. What was this place? Why had Mr. Davis kept it hidden? I stepped further into the room, my eyes scanning the walls, trying to make sense of the symbols. Some of them seemed familiar, but they twisted and warped in ways I couldn't explain. And then, my gaze fell upon the far corner of the room. There, in the shadows, was a figure. It was barely visible at first, like a dark silhouette, but as I took a step forward, the figure seemed to emerge from the darkness. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, with long, spindly arms. Its face was obscured, but the shape of its head was wrong, too large, too smooth. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was paralyzed, as if I had become part of the room itself, frozen in fear. The figure moved, its body shifting with an eerie fluidity, and I heard it speak. The voice was low, distorted, almost mechanical. "Why did you come here?" it asked, the words vibrating in the air. "You should have listened." I took a step back, my hands trembling. My mind raced. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. And yet, every part of me knew it was. Before I could turn and flee, a soft, cold touch grazed my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in. Panic rose within me, and I knew I needed to escape. But how? How could I leave when I couldn't even understand what was happening? The figure stepped closer, its movements too quick, too unnatural. I could feel its presence behind me, its breath cold against my neck. My pulse quickened. I ran. I bolted up the staircase, my legs burning as I scrambled back to the basement. The door, how could I have left it open? I reached the top, my hands shaking as I fumbled at the door, desperate to get out. The moment I opened the door, the whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices calling my name. I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart still racing. But the room felt wrong. The air was thick, oppressive. I wasn't alone anymore. I stumbled back into the basement, my breath ragged. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing: I had disturbed something. Something that was never meant to be disturbed. And as I turned to face Mr. Davis, still standing silently at the top of the stairs, I saw it in his eyes. He knew. He knew all along. I stood there, frozen, staring at Mr. Davis. He hadn't moved. He just watched me with that same unsettling calm, his hands clasped together in front of him. His expression was unreadable, but something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. "Mr. Davis, what was that?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't even know if I had spoken loud enough for him to hear. I was still trying to catch my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped forward slowly, his shoes making soft tapping sounds on the cold concrete floor. The silence between us felt thick, like something was waiting, something was watching. "You shouldn't have gone down there," he finally said, his voice low, almost regretful. I shook my head, trying to process what I had just seen. What was that thing? What did I just find? Mr. Davis let out a long, heavy sigh. "It's not something you can just explain. Not easily." I took a shaky step forward. "Please. I need to know. I need to understand." He hesitated for a long moment, his eyes flickering nervously toward the basement door. I could feel the tension in the air growing thicker, heavier with every passing second. Finally, he spoke. "It's not just a room," he said, his voice barely a murmur. "It's a place. A place where things happen. Things that shouldn't happen. And once you've seen it, once you've felt it, you can't forget. You can't ever leave it behind." The words hung in the air, their weight sinking into my bones. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying. "You mean to say that thing, the figure, it's real? It's not just some nightmare?" Mr. Davis's gaze flickered to the basement door once more, and then he nodded slowly. "It's real. And it's been here for years. I thought I could keep it locked away, keep it hidden. But now, it's too late." I felt a chill wash over me as the full weight of his words sank in. Something inside me screamed to run, to escape from this place, from Mr. Davis and everything he was saying. But at the same time, I couldn't tear myself away. My feet were glued to the floor, my body trembling. "What do you mean it's too late?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What does that mean for me? For all of us?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past me, his eyes distant, as if lost in a memory. His face was pale, drawn. "It's a curse," he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. "A curse that's been passed down through this house. No one who comes here can escape it. Not truly." I swallowed hard. "So, what happens now? What do I do?" Mr. Davis's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something other than fear in his gaze. There was something darker, something that made my stomach turn. "You survive," he said, his voice flat. "But you'll never be the same. No one who has seen what you've seen, or felt what you've felt, ever leaves unchanged." Suddenly, the basement door behind me creaked open. My heart leapt into my throat, and I spun around, my pulse racing. I had thought I had closed it. I was certain I had. But the door was wide open now, revealing nothing but darkness on the other side. The air felt colder, as if something was moving in that blackness, something that wasn't supposed to be there. The whispers returned, louder now. A cacophony of voices, distorted, inhuman. It was as if the very walls of the house were speaking to me, calling me back to that room. The room I should never have entered. "Don't," Mr. Davis warned, stepping forward. "You have to stop now. Leave it be." But it was too late. The pull was too strong. The darkness beckoned me, and I could feel the presence of whatever was lurking in the shadows. It was calling me by name, whispering things I couldn't understand. But I felt an undeniable compulsion to go, to face whatever waited beyond that door. I took a step toward it, my body moving against my will. Mr. Davis reached out, grabbing my arm, but his grip was weak. His face was filled with a mix of fear and regret. "Don't," he repeated, his voice breaking. "You can't." But it didn't matter. I couldn't turn back now. I pulled away from him and stepped through the door. As I crossed the threshold, the world seemed to shift. The air thickened, pressing down on me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could feel something following me, something moving just beyond the edge of my vision. And in that darkness, I knew this was just the beginning. I wasn't alone anymore. The house had changed, and so had I. I had crossed a line that could never be undone. And now, I would have to live with the consequences. The moment I stepped through the door, everything shifted. The darkness swallowed me whole, its oppressive weight pressing against my chest. I tried to take a breath, but the air was thick, suffocating. The whispers were now a constant presence, echoing in my ears, though I couldn't make out any words. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing with me, watching me. I reached out instinctively, my hands grazing the walls around me. They were cold to the touch, colder than anything I had ever felt. The stone beneath my fingers was slick with moisture, as if it had been untouched for years. But there was no time to think about that. I needed to move. I stumbled forward, my heart racing. The darkness was absolute, nothing but the faintest trace of light from the basement above. And yet, despite the oppressive gloom, I could feel the presence of something just beyond my reach. I wasn't alone. It was then that I heard it. A low, guttural sound, almost like a growl. I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place. The sound came from behind me, from the depths of the room. A shadow shifted at the edge of my vision, moving just out of the reach of the faint light. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Only the thick, impenetrable darkness. But the growl came again, closer this time. Louder. I was no longer alone. Whatever it was here with me. It had followed me into this place. Panic surged through me, and I took a step back, my breath quickening. But the room seemed to stretch, the walls growing farther apart, the ceiling rising higher. The space around me seemed to warp and twist, distorting into something unrecognizable. My head spun, the whispers growing louder, more frenzied. They surrounded me, drowning out everything else. The walls seemed to close in on me, as though the house itself was alive and tightening its grip. Then, a figure emerged from the darkness. At first, it was just a shape, a silhouette against the black. But as it stepped forward, I could see it clearly. It was tall, much taller than any person I had ever seen, its limbs too long, too thin. Its face was a blur of shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. A chill ran through me as I realized the figure wasn't just a person. It was something else, something unnatural, something that belonged to this place, this cursed house. I tried to back away, but my legs refused to move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure. It took another step forward, its presence overwhelming. The air around me grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that I could see my breath clouding in the darkness. And then it spoke. Its voice was deep, distorted, as though it was speaking from the depths of the earth itself. "You shouldn't have come here," it rumbled, each word vibrating in my bones. "Now you are mine." I gasped, panic rising like a wave in my chest. I couldn't breathe. The weight of its voice crushed me, suffocating me, as if the very words themselves were alive. My mind raced, scrambling for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. The figure took another step, and I could feel the ground beneath me begin to shake, like the very foundation of the house was trembling. The walls distorted, warping into strange, grotesque shapes. I could feel the house's pulse, a slow, steady rhythm, like a beating heart. And then, I saw it. In the darkness, the figure's face began to take shape. It wasn't a human face, not at all. It was a mask, a hollow, featureless face with hollow eyes, empty and cold, staring into my soul. And beneath it, something else, something darker, something older, stirred. It was as though the house had given birth to this thing, this creature, and now it was coming for me. My heart slammed against my ribcage. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I could hear the low, with sound of something moving through the darkness. Something slithering, something crawling toward me. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't face this thing. But my body refused to obey. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The creature stepped closer, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it moved toward me. Its presence was suffocating, and I could feel my mind unraveling under the weight of it. It was too much, too overwhelming. And then, just as I thought I would be consumed by the darkness, I heard a voice, a familiar voice, cutting through the whispers. "Run." It was Mr. Davis. Without thinking, I snapped out of my trance, my body moving on its own. I turned and bolted, my feet pounding against the cold floor, the sound of the creature's growls echoing behind me. I didn't dare look back. The air was thick, suffocating, but I pushed through it, blindly running toward the basement door. My heart raced, my breath ragged, and as I reached the door, I slammed it shut behind me. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed me, swirling in the air like an endless storm. The house was alive, and it wasn't letting me go. I turned, my back pressed against the door, and found Mr. Davis standing at the top of the basement stairs, his face pale, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have gone down there," he said again, his voice hollow, as if he had said it 1,000 times. But now, I understood. It wasn't just a warning. It was the truth. I had awakened something that could never be put back to sleep. And now, it was after me. The basement door trembled behind me, the soft thumping of something against it reverberating through the wood. I could feel the presence of the creature even though I couldn't see it. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and something fouler, something ancient, something that didn't belong. I pressed my back against the door, trembling, trying to steady my breath. My heart pounded in my chest, but the whispers were louder now, like they were pressing into my mind, clawing at my thoughts. Mr. Davis stood at the top of the stairs, silent, his expression unreadable. The flickering light above cast strange shadows on his face, giving him an otherworldly appearance. I wanted to scream, to ask him why he hadn't warned me sooner, why he had let me walk straight into this nightmare. But the words wouldn't come. "You need to leave," Mr. Davis said softly, as though he were speaking to himself. His eyes were fixed on the door, but his words seemed to be meant for me. "You need to leave before it's too late." I glanced over my shoulder, my eyes falling on the door. The sound was still there, soft tapping, like something scratching at the wood from the other side. It was only a matter of time before it broke through. "What is it? What did I awaken?" My voice was hoarse, trembling. I could barely hear myself over the chaotic rush of my heartbeat and the murmurs in my mind. Mr. Davis took a deep breath, his eyes darting to the basement stairs, as if he were looking for something or waiting for something. "It's called a wraith. A spirit, a thing, not alive, not dead. A shadow, but a shadow that hunts. It's been here for longer than I've known. Longer than anyone can remember." I shook my head, confused. "A wraith? How is it connected to the house? Why hasn't it left before?" He looked down, his hands trembling. "The house holds it, binds it, keeps it in the dark until it's disturbed. I thought I had kept it at bay, hidden away. But now you've seen it. It has found you." I backed away from the door, not knowing where else to go, but every inch of space felt suffocating. The walls of the basement seemed to close in on me, as if they were conspiring with whatever lurked in the shadows. My mind raced, 1,000 thoughts fighting for dominance, but the growing sense of dread buried them all. "We have to leave," I whispered, my words almost too quiet to be heard. "We have to leave now." But Mr. Davis didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the door, lost in thought. "The price is already paid," he murmured. "It won't let you leave until it has you." I felt the ground shift beneath me as the whispering grew louder. It wasn't just voices anymore, it was like the air itself was vibrating with the hum of something terrible, something ancient. The creature, it wasn't just waiting. It was preparing. Suddenly, the door behind me shook violently. The tapping was no longer soft, it was sharp, forceful, like something was clawing at the wood with intent. I heard the faintest crack as the hinges began to give way. My eyes widened in panic. There was no escape now. "It's coming," I gasped, my legs giving way beneath me as I fell to the floor. My hands scrambled to find something, anything, to hold on to. The whispers, those voices, they were everywhere now, filling the room, pressing in on me. Mr. Davis's face twisted in fear. "It's not just the house. It's you. It knows you're here. And it won't stop until it has you, until it makes you one of them." I staggered to my feet, desperate for some kind of solution, anything to stop the impending doom. But my mind was reeling, my body shaking uncontrollably. There had to be something, some way to stop it. I turned to Mr. Davis, searching his eyes for any hint of a plan. "What can we do?" I pleaded. "Please, you know something. You have to know a way to stop this." He closed his eyes, his face contorting with the weight of the truth. "There's no way to stop it once it's been awakened. It takes what it wants. And once it has its mark, it will not release you. Not until it has consumed you completely." I could hear the scratching louder now, as if the thing behind the door was already inside, moving through the walls, tearing at the fabric of the house. "Then what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, filled with dread. What do we do?" He looked at me with hollow eyes, his voice cracked and broken. "You either face it, or you run. But if you run, it will never stop following you. It will tear you apart." The room seemed to close in around me as I turned toward the door. It was now more than just a door. It was a gateway, a threshold to something that had been dormant for far too long, and now it was awake. I could feel its hunger. I turned back to Mr. Davis, a look of hopelessness crossing his face. What if I try to face it? What if I try to fight it? He shook his head slowly. "There is no fighting it. You cannot fight something that is not alive, not truly. The only way to stop it." He paused, his voice barely audible, "is to take its place." I recoiled at his words. "What?" "You have to sacrifice yourself," he whispered. "You have to offer yourself to it. Only then will it leave you, only then will it move on." My mind spun with the impossibility of it. The horror of what he was suggesting, what he was implying. I couldn't, there had to be another way. But before I could speak, the door behind me burst open. And I saw it. The Wraith. It was a shape, a shadow, but not just a shadow. It was like the darkness itself had taken form, a twisted, moving silhouette with glowing, hollow eyes. The creature's limbs stretched unnaturally long, and its face, if you could call it that, was nothing more than a black void. The whispers flooded the room, a cacophony of voices screaming, all of them blending into one. It took a step toward me, its limbs jerking in unnatural movements. And I realized, with a sickening feeling, that the price for survival had already been set. It had always been coming for me. And now, it was time to pay. Have you ever bought something and immediately felt like it didn't belong? That feeling, like something is wrong, even though everything seems perfectly fine? That's how it was with the wardrobe I picked up last month. It wasn't anything special, at least not at first glance. Old, wooden, with dark varnish that had worn thin over time. A few scratches here and there, a few knots in the wood, nothing alarming. But there was something about it. Something I couldn't quite shake. Maybe it was the strange way it felt heavier than it should have been when I moved it into my apartment, or maybe it was just the unsettling way the doors creaked as I opened them, but I felt it. Something was off. I thought it would just take a coat of paint, maybe fix up the hinges, and it would be like new. But when I started unpacking my clothes into it, that's when things began to change. The first time I heard the voices, I thought I was imagining things. I was getting ready for bed when, from the direction of the wardrobe, I heard a faint whisper. I thought it was the wind, or maybe the old pipes in the wall. I ignored it, convinced I was just tired. But then it happened again the next night. And the next. Low, murmured voices, like a distant conversation, always coming from inside the wardrobe. Sometimes I could hear faint rustling, like something was moving around inside, even though I was sure I checked it thoroughly. I told myself it was nothing. Old furniture sometimes has its quirks. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't ignore them anymore. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I didn't want to believe it. But when the voices started calling my name, softly at first, then more clearly, more urgently, I could no longer pretend. "Come closer," one of them whispered, almost tenderly. "We've been waiting for you." I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I stood there in the dim light of my bedroom, staring at the wardrobe. My heart raced, and my pulse quickened. I looked around, half expecting someone to jump out at me from behind the door, but there was no one. Just the faint, uneasy silence filling the room again. I told myself it was impossible. No one else had ever heard these things. Not a single person. But the voices continued, quiet, gentle whispers, like someone was standing right behind me, murmuring things I couldn't quite understand. It was as though the wardrobe itself had become a portal, a bridge between my world and something else. But what? And why me? I thought about getting rid of it, taking it back, but something kept me from doing it. A strange pull, like I was being drawn into something I couldn't resist. The idea of opening the wardrobe and confronting whatever was inside filled me with dread, but at the same time, I couldn't stop myself from wanting to know. One night, the voices grew louder, more desperate. I could hear distinct words now, as if they were right there in the room with me, calling to me. Let us out. We've been waiting so long. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a command. I couldn't stand it anymore. I walked across the room, my feet heavy on the floor, and I stood in front of the wardrobe. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handles. The whispers grew more frantic. I could hear them clearly now, calling my name, begging me to open the doors. With one final, shaky breath, I pulled them open. The inside was dark, too dark. There was no light in there, yet the space seemed to stretch far deeper than it should have. A blackness that didn't belong, a void that didn't make sense. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold chill creep up my spine. I could see nothing inside, but the voices grew louder, almost deafening now. Come in, they urged. It's time. I recoiled, stepping back instinctively. My pulse raced. Every part of me screamed to leave, to run. But I couldn't tear my eyes away from the wardrobe. It was as if something was drawing me in, pulling me toward the blackness that waited inside. Then, a figure appeared. It wasn't fully formed, just a silhouette, a shadow in the darkness. I could make out the faintest shape of a human form, but it was wrong. It didn't move like a person. It was more like a distortion, like something trying to be human but failing. Its eyes glowed faintly, two orbs of light in the otherwise impenetrable darkness. Come closer, it whispered again, and this time I could hear a strange, almost longing tone in its voice. You can join us. We've been waiting. I took a step back, my heart racing. There was no way I could go in there. Not with whatever that thing was waiting for me. But the whispering didn't stop. It never stopped. And with every passing night, the pull grew stronger. The voices became more persistent, more demanding. I didn't know what would happen if I opened the wardrobe again, but I was terrified to find out. So, I did what any sane person would do. I closed the doors, locked them, and I tried to forget. But the voices didn't stop, and they never would. The days that followed were the quietest I had ever known. It was almost too quiet, as if the world around me had taken a breath and held it in anticipation. I avoided the wardrobe. I kept my distance, not daring to look at it, afraid that the voices might start again. But in the back of my mind, I knew I couldn't just ignore it forever. I tried to go on with my daily life. I worked, ate, slept. But there was an ever-present tension in my chest, like a string pulled too tight, threatening to snap at any moment. And every time I passed the wardrobe, I couldn't help but glance at it, wondering if the voices would return. It was late one evening when I first felt it, the pull. It started small, just a faint tug in the back of my mind. At first, I tried to ignore it, but the feeling grew stronger with every passing minute. A voice inside me whispered, not from the wardrobe, but from somewhere deeper. You can't resist forever. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, staring at the wardrobe. I could feel my heart rate increasing, my breath shallow, but there was something else too, something I couldn't deny. A strange curiosity. A temptation. A need to know what was inside. What the voices were. I walked toward the wardrobe, almost against my will. My hands shook as I reached for the handles again, but this time I hesitated. The voices, which had been silent for days, were growing louder, their whispers turning into something more urgent, more desperate. Please, they begged. Come in. I tried to pull my hand away, but it was as if something inside me wouldn't let go. A force, invisible but undeniable, was pulling me closer. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was dangerous. But I couldn't stop myself. The moment my fingers touched the cold wood, the whispers turned into distinct words. We've been waiting for you. I opened the door. The darkness inside seemed to consume everything, swallowing the light in the room. It was deeper than it should have been, like an endless tunnel that stretched into nothingness. And in the center of that darkness, there was movement. A shape, a silhouette, something that didn't belong. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away. The figure inside was slowly taking form, its edges becoming sharper, clearer. I could see the outline of a face, but it wasn't human. It was twisted, a distortion of something that might have once been alive. Its eyes glowed, the faint light from them flickering like dying stars. The figure reached out, its hand extending toward me, long fingers stretching unnaturally, like they were reaching for something they had lost. Come closer, the voice said again, and this time it was not just one voice. It was many, overlapping, all speaking at once, their tones blending together in an eerie harmony. Come to us. It's where you belong. A cold wave of fear washed over me, and for a moment I thought I might collapse. But still, I couldn't look away. There was something about the figure, something compelling, like it knew me, like it was calling me home. I took a step forward. And then the door slammed shut. The sudden sound was deafening. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The room felt suffocating, the air thick with an oppressive presence. The whispers were gone, replaced by eerie silence. But it wasn't just the silence that unnerved me. It was the feeling that something had changed. The wardrobe was closed, but I could feel it. The thing inside. It was still there, waiting, watching. I turned, ready to run, but then I heard it again. A knock. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent. It came from inside the wardrobe. I stood frozen, staring at the door. The sound was unmistakable. There was something inside, something that wanted out. And it knew I was listening. The knock came again, louder now, like someone was banging their fists against the inside of the wood. I stepped back, shaking. I couldn't stay in the same room. I needed to leave, to get away from that thing. But as I turned to grab my coat, I felt it. A coldness, creeping over my skin, like ice settling deep in my bones. I could hear the voice again. Low, seductive, coaxing me. You can't leave. Not now. I spun around, my mind reeling. I hadn't said a word. I hadn't even moved toward the door, yet the voice was clear as day. "You opened the door," it said. "You invited us in." I tried to run, to leave the apartment, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the floor had become part of the wardrobe, part of the darkness. Every step I took felt heavier, like something was pulling me back. The knocking continued, now accompanied by a voice, a familiar voice, one I hadn't heard in years. "Don't leave me," it whispered. "Don't leave me alone." I knew that voice. I knew it all too well. It was my sister, Emily. She had been missing for years. Disappeared without a trace. They never found her. But now, I could hear her. Inside the wardrobe. Calling for me. "Please, help me," she begged. "Come in. I'm here." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My mind was filled with the sound of her voice, and the thing that had taken her, the thing that had been waiting for me, was inside the wardrobe, waiting to claim me too. And in that moment, I knew one thing for certain. I was never going to be free. Not now. Not ever. The wardrobe had claimed me, just like it had claimed her. And the voices would never stop. I woke up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, my body trembling. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. The knock on the wardrobe door, the whispers, my sister's voice calling from inside, surely it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I blinked, trying to focus, my eyes darting around the room. Everything seemed normal. The familiar walls, the bed I had woken up in countless times before. But then I saw it. The wardrobe door was slightly ajar. I froze. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't touched it. I had locked it the night before, hadn't I? My mind raced, but no explanation came. My body moved on its own, my feet carrying me to the wardrobe as if some invisible force was guiding me. The door creaked as I gently pushed it open, the air inside thick with an unnatural cold. But this time, it was different. There was no darkness, no shadowy figure waiting inside. Instead, the space seemed almost inviting, as though it was calling me to step forward. I stood there for a moment, frozen, staring into the space that should have been empty. But it wasn't. There, in the back of the wardrobe, a soft, dim glow flickered. The light was faint, as if coming from an impossible distance, from a place I couldn't quite see. And then, I heard the voice again. "Come closer, it's time." It wasn't just the voice of my sister this time. It was something else. Something more. I could feel it in my bones, this strange compulsion to obey. To listen. To step inside. Before I could stop myself, my hand reached out, brushing against the cool wood of the wardrobe's edge. The moment I touched it, the ground beneath me shifted, as though the room was tilting, pulling me in. The faint light grew brighter, and a sudden gust of wind blew through the room, cold and forceful, like something was trying to drag me inside. "Don't fight it," the voice urged, its tone calm but filled with an undeniable urgency. "It's too late now." I tried to pull away, but my body wouldn't obey. The grip on me was too strong. The wardrobe seemed to grow, expanding, stretching, until it was all I could see. The walls around me blurred, and I felt myself being pulled toward the light, as if it was the only thing that mattered, the only thing that existed anymore. And then, I stepped inside. The moment I did, everything changed. The world I had known shattered. It wasn't just the wardrobe that was different, it was the entire reality. The floor beneath my feet felt soft and spongy, like walking on clouds. The air was thick and humid, heavy with an otherworldly scent that clung to my skin. I couldn't see anything clearly, just vague shapes moving in the distance, shifting and flickering like shadows in a dream. The voices, too, were different. They weren't just whispers now. They were clear, calling to me from all directions, pulling me deeper into this strange space. My name echoed through the air, over and over, in a chorus of voices, some familiar, some completely foreign. "Help me," my sister's voice cried. "Come to me." But something wasn't right. The longer I stood there, the more I realized that this wasn't just a place of memory. This was a place of something darker. The shapes moving in the distance weren't human. They were twisted, grotesque, with eyes that shone in the dark like dying stars. They seemed to be watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I tried to speak, but no words came. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, sluggish, as though I were walking through thick mud. Every step felt like a struggle, and the further I went, the stronger the pull became. "Come," the voices urged. "You're almost here." I could feel the presence of something in front of me, something that had been waiting for me. It was too close now, its presence suffocating, overwhelming. A sudden movement in the corner of my vision made me turn, and for a split second, I thought I saw something familiar, a face, staring at me from the shadows. It was Emily. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was something wrong with her. Something twisted in her expression. Her mouth opened, but instead of words, only a low, guttural growl escaped. The once familiar face was now contorted, a grotesque parody of the person I had known. "Help me," she whispered, but the voice was no longer hers. It was hollow, echoing with something that wasn't human. I stumbled back, my breath ragged. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped me. I turned, hoping to find an exit, but the world around me was changing again. The light flickered and shifted, and the walls of this twisted place began to close in, narrowing, trapping me. The shadows grew longer, darker, like they were reaching out to pull me in. Something brushed against my arm, cold and clammy, and I instinctively recoiled. I looked around, my mind spiraling, trying to find a way out, but it was too late. The walls had closed in completely. There was nowhere to go. And then, the figure appeared again. The same one that had watched me from inside the wardrobe. Its form was clearer now, its twisted body more solid. Its eyes glowed, and it smiled, a wide, sickening grin that stretched too far across its face. "You've come," it said. Its voice was a low growl, but somehow familiar, like it had always been with me. I took a step back, but it was no use. I was already too far gone. The voices, the shadows, the oppressive cold, they had taken me. And there was no turning back. The last thing I heard before everything went dark was a soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Welcome home." And then, there was only silence. The silence was deafening. It wrapped around me like a thick blanket, smothering every thought, every fear, until there was nothing left but the empty blackness. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even breathe properly, as if the very air had turned against me, thick and oppressive. But then, slowly, ever so slowly, the darkness began to fade. A faint glow crept into the corners of my vision, like the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. It wasn't much, just a hint, a whisper of something that felt real, solid. I focused on it, pulled towards it by an unseen force, and as I did, I could feel the weight of my body returning. My arms and legs, which had felt numb, stiff, were now responding again, though they felt heavy, sluggish. The light grew brighter, spreading like ink in water, until I could see. I was no longer in the strange, twisted space I had been pulled into. I was somewhere else, somewhere familiar, but not in the way I expected. I looked around, my heart pounding as I tried to understand where I was. The walls were the same, but they were warped, stretched, like they were melting. The edges of the room flickered, distorting in and out of focus, like a photograph being torn apart. And then I saw it. The wardrobe. But this time, it was different. The wardrobe that had once been a simple piece of furniture was now massive, towering over me, stretching impossibly high, its wooden surface warped and cracked. The door was wide open, revealing not the dark interior I had first seen, but a blinding light, a light that seemed to pulse with energy, as though it were alive. I knew, in that moment, that I wasn't truly in the room anymore. I wasn't even in the same world. I stumbled toward the wardrobe, drawn to it by some primal instinct. As I reached the threshold, I felt a force grip my chest, pulling me forward, urging me to step inside. But something inside me resisted. Something deep down, maybe it was fear, maybe it was the remnants of my sanity, fought back against the overwhelming urge. I hesitated. "Don't go in," a voice whispered. It was Emily's voice, but it was different now, softer, tinged with sadness. "You don't belong here." I stood frozen, torn between the pull of the wardrobe and the voice that had once been my sister's. But the voice was fading, replaced by the growl of the figure I had seen in the dark world. Its words were low and mocking. "Come, it's too late to turn back. You're already ours." The figure stepped forward, and I saw its shape more clearly now, the twisted, grotesque form that seemed to shift and change with every step it took. Its eyes were glowing brighter than before, and its smile stretched wider, exposing rows of sharp teeth. "No," I muttered to myself, taking a step back. "I won't go." But the voice of the figure rose, and this time it was not just one. It was many, all speaking at once, a cacophony of twisted whispers and growls that filled the room. The sound was unbearable, deafening, as if the walls themselves were vibrating with the force of their words. "You can't escape," they all said in unison. "You opened the door. You called us here." The realization hit me like a physical blow. The wardrobe wasn't just a doorway. It wasn't just a portal. It was a trap. And I had walked right into it. The voices, the ones I had heard for days, had been waiting for me, luring me in with promises of answers, of closure, but they were lies. All of it was a lie. I glanced at the wardrobe again. The light inside pulsed, growing stronger, pulling at me. But I knew, now, what it was. It wasn't salvation. It wasn't freedom. It was a prison. A prison that had been built over time, a place that fed on the souls of those who stepped inside, trapping them in an endless cycle of torment and fear. And then, the truth struck me like a bolt of lightning. I wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't my world. I was the one who had opened the door. I had let them in. And I had taken Emily with me. She had never disappeared. She had never gone missing. She had been trapped here, just like me. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest as the walls seemed to close in around me. The light from the wardrobe grew brighter, and the voices grew louder. My body screamed to run, to escape, but the weight of the truth was too much. I had already crossed the line. There was no going back. "Please," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." The figure stepped closer, its shadow falling over me like a suffocating blanket. The smile never left its face, but its eyes, those glowing eyes, held something else. Recognition. "You should have never opened that door," it said softly, its voice no longer mocking. "Now, you are ours. Forever." And then, the light from the wardrobe flooded the room, blinding me completely. When the light finally receded, I was standing in the same room, but everything had changed. The walls were the same, but now they were suffocatingly close. The air was thick with a strange, metallic scent, and the floor beneath me was cold and slick. The wardrobe was gone. But I knew, deep down, it wasn't gone. It was still here, somewhere, waiting, watching. The voices had stopped. For now. And as I stood there, in the stillness, I realized something. Something terrifying. The wardrobe hadn't just taken me. It had taken my soul. My essence. The part of me that made me who I was. It had twisted it, warped it, and now I was trapped. Trapped in a world I didn't belong to, a place where the voices never stopped and the light never faded. And as I looked around, I saw them. The figures in the shadows, waiting for their turn. Waiting for the next soul to fall. And I knew then, with a certainty I couldn't shake, I wasn't the last. I would never be the last. There would always be more. And I would be there, waiting, too. Forever. Have you ever stopped to wonder if your shadow is really yours? I never thought about it, not until I started noticing strange things. Things that seemed harmless at first, just fleeting moments of confusion, you know? But they kept happening, and I couldn't ignore them. It all started one evening, after a long day at work. The sun had just begun to set, and I was heading home, the familiar path down the street calming me. I always found comfort in routine. As I walked, I glanced at my shadow stretching along the pavement in front of me. But something was off. It didn't move the way it should. I stopped, thinking I must have been mistaken. My feet stood still, but my shadow seemed to shift. It didn't match my movements exactly, like it was out of sync. I squinted at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the longer I stared, the more unsettling it became. It was as if my shadow had a life of its own. It jerked slightly to one side, as if straining to move without me. I quickly shook the thought from my mind. It's just the light, I told myself. Nothing more. But that wasn't true. As the evening wore on, I felt a creeping unease settle over me. Once I was home, I tried to push the odd experience from my mind. I cooked dinner, watched a little TV, and tried to relax. But the house was too quiet, the air too still. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next time I glanced at the corner of my eye, the shadow on the wall didn't match me. It stretched unnaturally long, and its shape looked wrong. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I realized something. I wasn't moving. I was standing perfectly still, but the shadow was shifting. I took a step back, my heart pounding, and the shadow seemed to follow me. It wasn't just following. It was moving independently, as though it was trying to break free. I blinked, and for a moment, it stopped. For a split second, it was as if it hadn't moved at all. But I could feel it. its presence lurking just beyond my control. Okay, this is ridiculous, I muttered to myself. It must have been a trick of the light or my eyes playing tricks. But the next morning, it happened again. I was getting ready for work, staring at myself in the mirror as I adjusted my tie. And then I noticed it again, the shadow. It was no longer mimicking my movements. It was moving on its own, shifting in ways that I couldn't explain. I reached out to touch it, but my fingers brushed against the cold surface of the wall, and the shadows seemed to ripple like water disturbed by an unseen force. It didn't move like I did, like a shadow should. It had its own purpose, its own direction. And then, as I stood there, in the quiet of my own home, the unimaginable happened. The shadow vanished. In the blink of an eye, it was gone. Completely. I was left standing in front of the mirror, my reflection staring back at me. Alone. In the silence, it was like the world had stopped spinning. I couldn't breathe. Was this happening? Or was I losing my mind? But I knew it wasn't just in my head. I could feel it, something was wrong. Something had changed. I had become aware of it, and that awareness, it felt like a curse. The shadow wasn't gone. It was out there, somewhere, moving on its own. And I had no idea what it wanted. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way the shadow had moved on its own, and then disappeared without a trace. I told myself it was nothing. A figment of my imagination, maybe brought on by stress. But the more I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, the more it gnawed at me. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore it. I went through my normal routine, convincing myself it was just a strange occurrence. But each time I walked into a room, the sensation that something was off returned. I could feel it, the shadow lurking at the edge of my vision, just beyond my reach. At first, it was subtle. I'd catch a glimpse of it out of the corner of my eye. It would move when I didn't, just slightly, like a ripple in the air. I'd look, and it would freeze, as though it had been caught in the act. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when it started moving again. One evening, I sat on the couch, flipping through channels, trying to distract myself from the growing unease. The house was quiet, too quiet. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in. I glanced over at the floor where my shadow should have been cast in the light of the lamp beside me. But there was nothing. I stared at the empty floor, my heart racing. Nothing. No shadow. I stood up quickly, the floor creaking under my feet. I reached toward the lamp to adjust its position, but as I did, I noticed something in the reflection of the window. A faint shape. A dark outline against the glass. The shadow. But it wasn't in the right place. It was standing behind me, not on the floor. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat. The room was empty. Nothing was there. I was alone. I swallowed hard, trying to calm my nerves. My hands shook as I reached for my phone, dialing the number of my best friend, Marcus. He always knew how to make me feel better, and right now, I needed reassurance more than anything. The phone rang several times before he picked up. Hello? His voice sounded groggy, like I had woken him up. Marcus, something's wrong. Something's happening to me. I think I'm losing my mind. My voice cracked slightly. Hey, take it easy. What happened? He asked, his tone soothing, though I could hear the concern in his voice. I don't know how to explain it, but my shadow, my shadow was moving on its own. It's like it's alive, and now it's gone, and I don't know what's happening. My words tumbled out, frantic and desperate. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Did you drink tonight? Marcus asked carefully. No. I'm not drunk, I swear. I don't know what's going on. The shadow, it's like it's trying to do something. I'm telling you, it's real. Okay. I'll come over. Just stay put. You're freaking me out a bit, but I'll be there soon. I hung up, feeling a little bit better, knowing Marcus was coming over. He always helped put things into perspective. But as I stood in the middle of the room, waiting, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My eyes darted nervously around the space, and I couldn't help but look at the corners, the edges of the walls, expecting to see something move, to feel something shift. The longer I waited, the worse it got. The silence grew unbearable. The air around me felt thick, heavy. I could almost hear my heartbeat in my ears. Then, I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, my shadow, began to stretch. It crept along the floor, moving slowly, deliberately, as though it had a mind of its own. It twisted and bent, reaching out towards me. I froze, my blood running cold. This time, there was no mistaking it. The shadow was moving without me, and it was coming closer. I took a step back, but the shadow mirrored my movement, creeping right after me. My heart pounded in my chest as I felt my legs shake. I reached for the nearest object, a lamp, and threw it toward the shadow in a panic. The lamp hit the floor with a crash, and for a brief moment, the room went dark. In the silence that followed, I stood perfectly still, trying to hear anything that would tell me what was happening. But all I heard was my own breath, shallow and frantic. The light flickered back on. The shadow was gone. I could hear the sound of the front door opening. It was Marcus. He rushed in, concern written across his face. "What the hell's going on here?" he asked. "Are you okay?" I don't know," I stammered, pointing at the floor. It was here. The shadow. It's moving, Marcus. It's moving, and I can't make it stop. He walked over to the spot where I had last seen the shadow, but there was nothing. Just the faint remnants of my fear lingering in the air. "I don't see anything, man," he said slowly. "Maybe you need to get some rest. This sounds like, I don't know, stress, maybe. I'm not imagining this, Marcus. It's real." He looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Okay, well, I'll stay with you for the night. Let's just try to take it easy." As he settled into the couch, I couldn't help but glance at the corners of the room again. The shadows, they were still there. But this time, I was waiting for them. And I knew they were watching me. The hours dragged on slowly, every minute stretching longer than the last. Marcus, sprawled out on the couch, seemed to be in a deep sleep. I envied him. How could he sleep when I knew something was wrong? When I could feel it lurking in the shadows? I couldn't stop glancing around the room. Every time I looked away, I felt the weight of the unseen presence. My own shadow, or whatever it had become, wasn't just moving anymore. It was waiting. As I sat in the chair, my mind began to spiral. I kept telling myself that I was losing control, that I was overreacting. But the sensation wouldn't go away. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the air around me growing heavier, thicker. It felt like the room was closing in, like the walls themselves were closing in on me. I glanced at the clock. It was well past midnight. Marcus was still asleep, his breathing steady and calm. But I couldn't afford to close my eyes. Not now. I had to stay alert. The silence in the room was suffocating. Then, a sound. A faint scraping noise, like something dragging across the floor. It came from behind me. I turned quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was nothing. Just the empty room. I stood up, my legs weak from the tension. I could feel my breath catching in my throat. The sound had come from somewhere near the corner where the shadows seemed to gather the most. I slowly made my way to the corner, my every step deliberate, trying to remain as quiet as possible. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. I reached out to touch the wall. A chill ran through my fingers. It was colder than it should have been. Before I could pull my hand away, the sensation of being watched hit me like a blow to the chest. I froze, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And then I heard it. A whisper. Soft, almost imperceptible, like the rustling of leaves in a distant forest. But it wasn't distant. It was right there, in the room with me. I spun around, my breath coming in sharp gasps. Marcus stirred on the couch, but he didn't wake. He remained oblivious to the growing dread in the room. The whisper came again. This time, it was louder. Clearer. It sounded like a voice. My voice. I couldn't believe it. I stepped back, staring at the corner where the shadows seemed to stretch, to twist. It was like the very darkness itself was alive, crawling toward me, reaching out to pull me in. The voice whispered again. Come closer. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. I wanted to scream, to wake Marcus, but I couldn't make a sound. It felt like the air itself was thickening, choking me. I glanced at the door. The thought of running crossed my mind, but my feet were glued to the floor. I couldn't escape. The shadow was everywhere. It was here. The whisper came again, sharper now. Come to me. Without thinking, I took a step forward. My legs moved on their own, pulling me closer to the darkness. The closer I got, the more I felt something pulling me, a force I couldn't resist. My heart raced, panic rising in my chest. I tried to stop, but my body kept moving, as though the shadow was controlling me. My hand reached out, and before I could stop it, my fingers brushed against the darkened corner. The world went cold. Everything around me seemed to blur, fading away into nothingness. The room, Marcus, the shadows, they all disappeared. It was like I had been transported to another place entirely. A place of absolute darkness. The only sound was my own breathing, ragged and shallow. I looked around, but there was nothing to see, just an endless void. I couldn't tell if I was standing or falling, or if I was even still in the same place. Then, I heard it. The whisper again, but this time it wasn't soft. It was a scream. A scream that sounded like me. I turned in all directions, but there was no one there. I was alone in the darkness. Or so I thought. The shadow moved again. It was standing before me, but it wasn't the same. It was taller now, more defined. It took on the shape of a figure, a person. A dark silhouette that loomed in front of me, its form shifting and flickering like a flame. I couldn't move. My body was frozen with fear. The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward me, long and twisted. "No," I whispered, barely able to speak. "Please, no." The figure smiled, its face an empty void. And then I felt it. A cold, icy grip on my wrist. The shadow was touching me. I screamed, the sound coming out more like a desperate gasp. And in that instant, I was back. Back in my living room. But something had changed. The room was still the same, but the air was heavier, darker. The shadow in the corner had grown longer, stretching farther into the room. And I realized then, I wasn't alone anymore. The shadow was with me. And it wasn't going anywhere. The weight of the shadow felt suffocating, as though it had seeped into every corner of the room, every crevice of my mind. It wasn't just in the corner anymore, it was with me. Watching me. Waiting for me to make my next move. I couldn't breathe. The silence was unbearable. Every sound, even the quiet hum of the fridge, felt like it was drowning under the pressure of something unseen, something alive. I turned toward Marcus, my heart pounding. He was still asleep, undisturbed by the creeping darkness that had overtaken the room. How could he sleep through this? How could he not feel it? But then I noticed something. Something terrifying. His shadow wasn't still. It was moving. I took a hesitant step forward, unable to look away from the writhing figure cast by Marcus's form. The shape of it seemed to shift, elongating and shrinking, twisting as though it had a life of its own. And then, as if sensing my gaze, it began to creep toward me. I froze. This couldn't be happening. It couldn't. I turned toward the window, desperate to escape, to flee into the night and leave this madness behind. But the glass reflected only the darkened room, showing me nothing but shadows that seemed to dance and swirl on their own. The air was thick, suffocating. I could feel the pressure, the weight of something pushing down on me, and it wasn't just in the room, it was in my mind too. The shadows weren't just moving physically. They were clawing their way into my thoughts, drowning them out, replacing everything with fear. "Marcus," I whispered, my voice trembling, "wake up." There was no response. The figure, his shadow, was almost touching me now. It reached out toward my feet, stretching unnaturally long, as though it wanted to pull me down into the ground. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to leave. I had to run. My heart was beating so loudly in my ears I thought it might explode. The shadows were closing in on me, making everything feel smaller, tighter, more suffocating. I rushed to the door, yanked it open, and there, in the hallway, was something that made my blood run cold. A shape. A silhouette. Standing perfectly still, facing me. The hallway light flickered once, then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. My heart stopped. It wasn't a person. It was a shadow. A shadow of something that shouldn't have been there. Its outline shifted and jerked unnaturally, like it was alive, not bound by the rules of space or light. I stepped back, my breath coming in shallow, panic gasps. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was trapped. The darkness had taken hold of the entire house. The figure began to move. I turned, desperate to escape, but the hallway was gone. The door to the outside was no longer there. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, all warped, stretching into an endless void of shadow. The world around me was breaking apart, disintegrating into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. I spun around, searching for any escape, any hint of light. And then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A door. It stood at the far end of the hallway, a faint glow emanating from beneath it. For a split second, I thought I might have imagined it. But the shadow at the other end of the hallway was growing closer, moving faster now. If I didn't move, it would catch me. I ran. I didn't care if it was a trap. I didn't care if it was leading me into more darkness. I had to move, had to get away from the thing that was hunting me. The door loomed closer, the light beneath it now burning brighter. The air seemed to thin, to crackle with static as I approached it, and I reached out with trembling hands, slamming my palm against the door. It didn't budge. I jerked at the handle. Locked. Panic set in again, a suffocating wave. I was trapped. There was no way out. I heard the sound then, the soft, mocking footsteps of the shadow, coming closer. And then, like a blow to the chest, I heard the whisper again. You can't escape. It was my voice. But it wasn't me. It came from the other side of the door, muffled, like it was coming from inside. I stepped back, my legs shaking, my heart thundering in my ears. Then I saw it. A figure behind me, tall and thin, its shadow stretching impossibly far. It was watching me, but I could barely see it clearly. The features of the figure were obscured by the darkness, but I knew it was there. The shadows that had plagued me weren't just in the house. They had taken form. They were alive. They were real. And they were closing in. I screamed. But nothing happened. No sound. No escape. The world around me was darkening, suffocating, closing in on all sides. And then, I was alone. I opened my eyes. I didn't know I'd closed them, but I did know that the world had changed. I wasn't in the hallway anymore. I wasn't even sure where I was. The room was dim, almost suffocatingly so. The air smelled stale, thick with the remnants of old wood and dust. The walls seemed to pulse, vibrating ever so slightly, as if the very structure of the house was alive, breathing. I was lying on the floor, cold against the stone, but I couldn't feel my body. The sensation had disappeared. All I could feel was the weight of something watching me. The shadow. It was here. In this room. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling beneath me. The room seemed to stretch outward in all directions, an endless maze of walls and corners, each one darker than the last. It was like walking through the inside of a nightmare. The door, the one I had tried to escape through, was no longer there. There was nothing but a vast, empty space. The shadows had claimed everything. But I couldn't just lie there. I couldn't let it win. I moved cautiously, my every step echoing in the unnatural silence. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, but I wasn't sure if it was mine or something else's. I turned a corner, my eyes scanning the room. The shadows twisted and shifted like living things. They followed me, always one step behind, growing longer and more menacing with every passing second. It was like I was in the belly of some ancient beast, its walls pulsing and throbbing with the rhythm of my fear. And then I saw it. A figure, dark and formless, standing at the far end of the room. Its silhouette stretched impossibly tall, its limbs long and contorted, like the shadow was bending, folding, becoming something else. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. My throat was dry, constricted. The only thing I could feel was the unrelenting cold, as though I were standing on the edge of some abyss, peering into the unknown. The shadow began to move, its shape shifting with every step, like liquid darkness pouring over the floor. I felt a pull, an undeniable force drawing me closer to it. I wanted to run, to fight, but my body refused to move. It was as though the very air had turned to stone, trapping me in place. The closer it came, the more I felt my own shadow bend and twist beneath me. I could feel it pulling away, as if the shadow I had once controlled was now controlling me. A voice echoed in my mind, but it wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's. It was the voice of the shadow. "Come to me," it whispered. I didn't know how, but I felt my body start to move toward it. I was no longer in control. The shadow was pulling me into the very heart of the darkness. "No." I tried to protest, but the word died on my lips, swallowed by the void. And then I understood. This wasn't a shadow. It was something far worse. It was a parasite. A living entity that had latched onto me, feeding off my fear, my confusion, my desperation. It wasn't just following me. It was trying to take over. It was trying to become me. The figure in the distance reached out a hand, its fingers impossibly long, stretching toward me like tendrils of pure darkness. It beckoned me closer, its cold touch pressing against my mind, trying to draw me into its eternal, empty abyss. I couldn't fight it anymore. The world around me blurred as the shadow enveloped me completely. The last thing I saw before everything went black was its empty, gaping face, a hole in the fabric of reality itself. And then, silence. The room, once filled with life, was now still. The shadows had reclaimed everything. No one would ever know what had happened to me or what I had seen. The house stood in eerie silence, the walls now void of any trace of the living. As for the shadow, it had found its new host. Have you ever felt something watch you, but when you turn, nothing is there? It's the kind of sensation that makes your skin crawl, the hairs on the back of your neck standing up, but when you look around, everything seems perfectly normal. What if, this time, it wasn't just your imagination? It started innocently enough, like most strange occurrences do. I had moved into a new apartment, a small but cozy space that seemed to promise peace after a difficult time in my life. I thought it would be the fresh start I needed. But something about that place didn't sit right with me from the moment I stepped inside. The first night, I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of what I'd left behind, the old place, the memories, and the uncertainty about what lay ahead. I tossed and turned, the quiet of the apartment almost too oppressive. Then, in the stillness of the night, I noticed something. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or a shadow cast by the street lamps outside. But as I blinked, my eyes adjusted, and I saw it more clearly. A hand hanging from the ceiling, just above my bed. It didn't move, but its presence felt alive, somehow. The fingers hung limply, stretched out as though reaching, though there was no clear source of the hand. The ceiling was too high for it to make any sense. It wasn't connected to anything, it was just there, suspended in midair. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. For a long time, I didn't know what to do. I blinked again, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the mind, fatigue playing its part. But when I opened my eyes once more, the hand was still there, just as real as anything else in the room. It didn't move. It didn't twitch. It simply hung, unmoving, as if waiting. My breath quickened. I tried to call out, but the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, that still, unblinking hand. The silence in the room was deafening, as though the very air had thickened with tension. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep. But sleep didn't come. I tossed and turned, haunted by the image of that hand. It wasn't until the first light of morning crept through the window that I finally drifted off, the hand still there, hanging from the ceiling like an impossible thing. When I awoke, I expected to find it gone. But to my horror, I saw that it was still there, though it was no longer as distinct as it had been. The hand seemed to be fading into the darkness of the ceiling, as if it had been waiting for something. My heart skipped a beat as I sat up, scanning the room. No, I hadn't imagined it. The hand was real. And what's worse, it seemed to have left something behind. Tiny, thin marks, like scratches, marred the ceiling above my bed. They were fresh, as if something had dragged itself across the surface. The hand had left its mark, and it was only the beginning. I knew something wasn't right, but I couldn't bring myself to move out. The apartment, the location, it was convenient. So I stayed. But the hand? It stayed with me, too. Every night, it was there, hanging from the ceiling. And with each passing night, the marks on the ceiling grew longer, deeper, as if the hand was getting closer. I didn't want to tell anyone. How could I explain it? They'd think I was crazy. So I kept it to myself, though I could feel the presence of that hand growing stronger, almost as though it had a life of its own. The days blurred together, but the nights were when it became unbearable. Something was changing. The hand wasn't just hanging anymore. I could feel its presence, closer, creeping in like the dark. I knew one thing for certain, this was no ordinary hand. And whatever it wasn't going to let me go. The second night was when it all started to unravel. I had hoped the first night was just a bad dream, a trick my mind had played on me due to stress. But as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the unease crept in again. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but the truth was inescapable. The hand was coming back. This time, I was more prepared, or at least, I thought I was. I told myself it was just a shadow, just a weird play of light from the street lamp outside the window. But as soon as I lay down, the heavy feeling filled the room again, the oppressive weight of something watching me. I tried to distract myself, turning over and pulling the blanket up over my head, but it did no good. My heart thudded in my chest, and the hairs on my arms stood up. It was as if the room had become a vacuum, pulling all the air out of the space around me. And then, the unmistakable chill, the sensation of being stared at from above. I dared not look, but my eyes betrayed me. I could feel it before I saw it, the fingers hanging down, just at the edge of my bed. This time, they twitched. Not much, but enough to send a jolt of terror through my veins. I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, the kind of frozen you get when you know something terrible is about to happen. The hand was still there, hovering above me, its shadow stretching across the ceiling, growing longer as if reaching out. And as if to prove that it wasn't just a trick of the light, I could see something new, the faintest trail of what looked like scratches. The same thin lines I had seen that morning, but now they were deeper, more pronounced. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to ignore it, but the noise started then. A faint, scratching sound, like nails dragging across the ceiling. I shot upright in bed, gasping for air. The hand had moved. The fingers had twitched again, and I could hear the faint scraping sound getting louder. It felt like the hand was testing the boundaries of my reality, probing for something something I couldn't understand. I had to look. I had no choice. Slowly, I turned my head, glancing upwards with dread pooling in my stomach. There it was. The hand, no longer stationary, but shifting. It wasn't just hanging. It was sliding, inching toward the edge of the ceiling, toward me. The scratching noise was becoming clearer, sharper. It was no longer a faint sound, it was a loud, rasping noise that filled the air. I wanted to scream, to jump out of bed and run, but my body betrayed me. I could barely move, my limbs heavy with terror. And then, just as I was about to break into a cold sweat, I saw something else, something worse. The marks. They weren't just scratches anymore. They were full-on gouges, deep enough to leave chunks of the ceiling hanging loosely, as if whatever had made them had been pulling itself up, inch by inch, closer and closer to where I lay. Each new mark seemed to be more urgent, more desperate. The hand, now fully visible in the dim light, began to curl its fingers, slowly, deliberately. It was no longer a passive presence, but an active force. The air felt thick, and I could almost hear a low hum, like something stirring just beneath the surface. I finally found the strength to stand, my body trembling uncontrollably as I stumbled toward the door. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob. But when I turned it, it wouldn't budge. The door, which had been so easy to open earlier that day, was now locked. I pulled at it frantically, but the handle remained stubbornly still. My panic reached its peak. I turned back to the room, and that's when I saw it. The hand had fully detached from the ceiling. It was hanging there, just above the bed, fingers outstretched. It no longer looked like a lifeless appendage. It had a form to it now, as if it was waiting, breathing, alive in some otherworldly way. Its shadow stretched long across the wall, taking shape, forming an outline that was almost human. I could feel it. I could feel the weight of its gaze, though I couldn't see its eyes. My heart raced faster than I thought possible. The scratching sound was louder now, more frantic, like claws scraping against the walls, and I was frozen in place, the terror immobilizing me. Then, the door clicked. I don't know how long I had stood there, but when I heard that sound, I snapped out of my stupor. I turned and yanked the door open with all my strength, bolting out of the room, my heart in my throat. I didn't care if it was irrational. I didn't care if I was making a scene. I just ran. I couldn't get out of the apartment fast enough, and I didn't stop running until I was standing on the street in the cold night air. My breath came in shallow gasps, my whole body shaking, but as I looked back at the building, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure, standing in the window of my apartment, staring down at me. It was just a shadow. But it wasn't mine. The hand was still there. I didn't sleep that night. The air outside was cold and harsh, but it did little to soothe the chill gnawing at my bones. I stood on the street, the eerie glow of the street lamps casting long shadows across the pavement, and every passing car seemed to rush by with a sense of urgency, as though they, too, were fleeing from something unseen. I should have gone to the authorities. I should have told someone, anyone, about the hand. But every time I thought about it, I could feel the weight of the words in my throat, heavy and suffocating. How could I explain it? How could I make someone understand that something as mundane as a hand, just a hand, had begun to haunt me, to come alive and destroy my peace? It didn't make sense. I pulled my coat tighter around me and made my way back inside, my footsteps echoing in the still night. The building loomed before me, a silhouette against the pale moonlight. My feet felt as if they were moving of their own accord, drawn back to the place I feared, as if the hand had somehow summoned me. When I stepped into the building, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes darted to every corner, every shadow. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, pounding so loudly that it drowned out the sound of my own footsteps. I reached the door to my apartment and hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The air inside was stale, stagnant, as though it had been holding its breath since I left. And then I saw it. The hand. It was there, once again, hanging from the ceiling. But this time, something was different. It wasn't just dangling idly above me. It was moving, ever so slightly, as if it was testing the air around it, as if it was preparing to strike. I froze, rooted to the spot, my breath caught in my throat. The fingers twitched again, and I could swear I heard the faintest whisper, just beyond the threshold of hearing. It was so soft, so faint, that I couldn't tell if it was real or just the result of my mind playing tricks on me. But then, as if to confirm my worst fear, I felt a sudden draft, a cold breeze, sweep through the room, carrying with it the faintest sound of scratching. The hand was moving toward me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But my body refused to obey. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the hand, watching in horror as it shifted, inch by inch, closer and closer to me. It was no longer just a shadow, no longer a mere appendage hanging from the ceiling. It was alive, and it was coming for me. My feet moved on their own, backing away, but the hand's fingers followed, a slow, deliberate pursuit. The scraping sound grew louder, and the air grew colder, heavier. The closer it got, the harder it was to breathe. I could feel the temperature in the room dropping, the walls closing in on me as though the very space itself was becoming more and more oppressive. I finally found my voice. I shouted, desperate, "No! Leave me alone." But the hand didn't stop. It reached for me, its long, bony fingers stretching out, brushing against the air, as if it could feel me, as if it could taste my fear. I ran, stumbling backward, my pulse racing, my mind scrambling for any escape. I grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it at the hand. The crash of glass against the floor startled me, but the hand didn't flinch. It didn't even hesitate. It just kept moving. I backed into the corner of the room, my back pressed against the wall, my limbs shaking uncontrollably. My breath came in ragged gasps, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was closing in on me. Then, the hand froze. It hung there in the air, suspended as if waiting for something, its fingers curling slowly, almost lazily. And then, for the first time since it had appeared, it seemed to speak to me. A voice. It was soft at first, a faint whisper, so quiet that I wasn't sure if it was real. But as the seconds passed, it grew louder, more insistent. "You belong to me now." The words sent a jolt through my entire body. The voice, low, deep, and full of malice, was not my own. It was a cold, otherworldly tone, one that seeped into my bones, twisting my insides, suffocating me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over until they drowned out everything else. "You belong to me now." The hand reached out again, its fingers curling toward me, and I could feel it, could feel the darkness closing in around me. The room, once familiar, felt like a cage, like a tomb, and I realized then that I might never leave this place, that the hand might take me, claim me as its own. And with that thought, everything went dark. I woke up with a start, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was silent, eerily so, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined everything. Perhaps it was just a bad dream, a product of my overactive imagination of the stress I had been under. But then, as my eyes adjusted to the dim light of the room, I saw it. The hand. It was still there, hanging from the ceiling, just as it had been before. But now, something was different. The shadows around it seemed darker, deeper, as if the darkness itself had gathered in the room, thickening, pooling beneath the hand like oil. I sat up in bed, frozen in place. My mind raced. Was this real? Was I still dreaming? Had I been pulled back into the nightmare, or had the hand truly returned, somehow stronger, more powerful than before? I reached out to touch the light switch beside my bed, but my hand trembled too much to grasp it properly. I could feel my fingers shaking, my palms slick with sweat. My breath caught in my throat, and a cold chill spread across my skin. That voice. The words rang through my mind again. You belong to me now. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away, trying to deny it. But the truth was inescapable. The hand was real, and I was helpless against it. I got out of bed slowly, trying not to make a sound. My feet sank into the cold wooden floor as I tiptoed toward the door, my eyes never leaving the hand. It hung there, suspended in midair, as if waiting, watching, and I knew, deep in my gut, that it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. But when I reached the door, I stopped. I could feel the air around me shift, the temperature dropping even further. The shadows deepened, and the room seemed to grow smaller, as though it was pressing in on me. I turned around, my heart racing. The hand, it was moving again. At first, it was slow, imperceptible. The fingers twitched, a barely noticeable motion, but I could feel it, like the pulse of something alive. Then, it began to sway gently, as though testing the air, reaching for me. I stumbled back, my legs unsteady, my mind screaming at me to run, to escape, but my body refused to listen. You belong to me now. The words echoed in my ears once more, louder this time, as if the hand were speaking directly to me, its presence undeniable. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe. I backed away into the corner of the room, my eyes never leaving the hand, but it wasn't enough. I couldn't escape the feeling of it. The very air seemed to thicken around me, heavy with a presence I couldn't see but could certainly feel. I reached for the door again, but just as my hand grasped the handle, a sharp, cold pain shot through my chest. My body jolted, and I gasped for air as if the breath had been stolen from me. I looked down in panic, but there was nothing there. No visible wound. No mark. But the pain was real. It was like a hand, something invisible, was pressing against my rib cage, squeezing, tightening, trying to crush the life out of me. I screamed, but the sound was choked, muffled, as if something was blocking my throat. My vision blurred, the room spinning, and I felt my knees give way beneath me. I fell to the floor with a thud, the world around me twisting and distorting as if I were caught in some terrible dream. And then, the hand, it descended. I watched in horror as the fingers, slow and deliberate, stretched downward, their shadows growing longer, closer, until they reached the floor. The cold air wrapped itself around me, tightening like a vice, and I could feel the floor beneath me trembling, like the room itself was alive. The hand was coming for me. You belong to me now, the voice whispered once again, this time closer, as though the words were being breathed directly into my ear. I tried to scream, to move, but my body refused to obey. It was as if the room, the shadows, the very darkness itself had taken control of me, had paralyzed me with fear. The hand was right above me now, its fingers curling, the sharp nails glinting in the faint light. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But nothing came. The air was thick, heavy with anticipation, but no touch, no pain came from the hand. I opened my eyes, confused, terrified, and looked up. The hand, it had stopped. It hovered there, just above me, its fingers curling into a fist, as though it were waiting. And then, slowly, the fingers began to twitch, one by one, and the hand started to withdraw. It retreated, moving upward, slowly, slowly, until it was once again hanging from the ceiling. But it wasn't gone. It was still there. Watching. Waiting. The voice lingered in my mind, echoing, repeating, "You belong to me now." And I realized then, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, that I was never going to be free of it. The hand wasn't just some passing nightmare, it was real, and it had claimed me. I was its prisoner. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of fear and confusion. The hand remained, always above me, always watching, a silent, malevolent presence that refused to leave. I could feel it even when I wasn't looking. Every time I entered the room, I knew it was there, waiting for me. But no matter how hard I tried, no matter how I braced myself, it never moved again. At least, not in a way I could see. The voices, however, were different. The whispers had started again, soft and insistent, crawling into my mind like the fingers of the hand themselves. "You belong to me now." The words became a constant refrain, repeating in my head at all hours of the day and night. I couldn't escape them. They haunted me, settled in the corners of my thoughts, until I began to question if I was losing my mind. The hand had left its mark on me in other ways. Each night, when I would wake, there were new scratches on the ceiling, deep gouges that weren't there before. Sometimes they were small, just a few lines, barely noticeable. Other times, they were long and jagged, as if something sharp had scraped across the surface with maddening force. Each one sent a wave of dread through me, a reminder that whatever this thing was, it wasn't finished with me yet. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that it was some trick of the light or my own imagination running wild. But the marks on the ceiling were real, and the air in my room had become thick with a strange energy, a weight that pressed down on me every time I lay down to sleep. I became afraid to sleep. And when I did finally sleep, I would dream. The dreams were always the same. I was lying in bed, frozen, unable to move. The hand would descend from the ceiling, its long fingers curling, and I would feel the cold, oppressive weight of its touch, as though it were pushing me into the bed, holding me down. The whispers would start, closer now, as though the hand itself were speaking directly into my ear. "You belong to me now." And then, in the dream, it would take me, drag me into the dark. The nightmares grew more vivid, more real, until I couldn't tell where the dream ended and reality began. I stopped leaving the house, stopped seeing people. I couldn't bear to be alone with it, but I couldn't escape it either. One night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, something changed. For the first time in weeks, the hand moved again. It was slow at first, just a twitch, a shift of its fingers. But this time, it wasn't just hovering. The hand began to lower itself, inch by inch, its shadow stretching longer and longer, creeping toward me. My heart pounded, my breath quickened, and I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I was frozen, trapped in my own skin, unable to move as the hand drew closer. Then, finally, it touched me. At first, there was nothing, just the chill of the air around me. But then, a cold, clammy sensation pressed against my chest. The fingers of the hand, long and bony, brushed against my skin. It was like ice, sharp and unyielding, and I gasped, trying to pull away, but I couldn't. I was pinned, held in place by the sheer force of its presence. The whispers grew louder now, louder than ever before. You belong to me now. Forever. And in that moment, I understood. The hand wasn't just a thing, it was a part of something much bigger, something older, something that had been waiting for me all along. I had been marked. Chosen. The darkness began to consume me, to swallow me whole, and I could feel myself being pulled toward it, as though it were a vast, bottomless pit. The air grew colder still, and the whispers turned into a roar, deafening in its intensity. I was being drawn into the abyss, my mind unraveling with each passing second. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The hand was gone. The room was silent, still, as if nothing had ever happened. I lay there, trembling, my body drenched in sweat. The air around me felt empty now, devoid of the oppressive weight that had suffocated me for so long. I looked up at the ceiling, half expecting to see the hand again, but there was nothing. The scratches, the marks, it was all gone. The room was just a room once more. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. It would never be over. I could feel it in my bones, in the air that still hummed with an unnatural energy. The hand had left its mark on me, but it had not let go. I had been claimed, and no matter how far I ran, no matter where I went, I would always carry its touch with me. I had become part of something far darker than I could have ever imagined. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I was alive or dead anymore. Have you ever felt like you were being watched, even when you were alone? That was the feeling I got when I stepped into the library that evening. The air inside was thick with the scent of old books, the kind that hadn't been touched in years. The creaky wooden floors groaned under my weight, and the dim lighting cast long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the rows of bookshelves. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. I had always loved the library, but tonight it felt different. I had no particular reason for coming. It was just a habit to stop by after work. The silence here always helped me think, helped me escape the world outside. I found a seat by the back wall, pulled a book from the shelf, and began reading. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. It lingered, hovering just beyond my awareness, like a presence in the corner of my eye. It wasn't until I glanced up from the book that I noticed something strange. There, on a small, dust-covered table in the far corner of the room, was an old leather-bound journal. It seemed completely out of place. The library wasn't known for having journals, especially ones that looked so worn and forgotten. I stood up, drawn toward it. As I approached, I noticed the faintest scratching noise, like nails on paper, but when I looked around, no one else was there. The noise stopped, and I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me. But the journal, it called to me. I reached out and picked it up, the cover creaking under my touch. The journal was heavier than it looked. I opened it cautiously, my eyes scanning the first page. It was filled with neat, precise handwriting, someone's careful thoughts laid out in ink. The first few pages seemed harmless enough, just a recounting of daily events, trivial moments of someone's life. But as I flipped through the pages, something started to catch my eye. The entries, they seemed oddly familiar. Details, descriptions of places, people, even moments in my own life, appeared on the pages. At first, I thought it was coincidence. After all, the world is full of common experiences. But then, I reached an entry that made my blood run cold. It was a detailed account of my day. From the time I woke up to the moment I entered the library, every minute was accounted for. Even the way I had brushed my hand through my hair, the exact phrase I had used when speaking to a colleague earlier in the day, it was all there. Every detail, every movement, written in this stranger's journal. The chill that crept down my spine was impossible to ignore. I couldn't stop reading. My fingers trembled as I turned the pages, reading about things I had done that day, things that no one but I could know. I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or losing my mind. But the strangest part was yet to come. The last page was a single, simple sentence, written in bold, tight letters. "Tomorrow, you will die." I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned the page, hoping for something, anything, to prove that this was some cruel joke. But there was nothing. Just that one line, mocking me with its certainty. I closed the journal and looked around the library. The shadows in the corners seemed to press in on me, the air thick with the oppressive weight of what I had just read. Could this be real? Could someone really have known my life so intimately, even my thoughts? And why had it said I would die tomorrow? I stood up, the journal still clutched in my hands, my mind racing. My legs felt weak beneath me, as if they could give way at any moment. I wanted to run. I wanted to throw the journal away and forget everything. But I knew I couldn't. Not now. The journal had given me a glimpse into something I couldn't explain, a glimpse into my fate, a fate I wasn't sure I could escape. I had to know more. I had to find out what this was, and why it had chosen me. As I walked out of the library, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was following me. The streets outside were quieter than usual, the shadows growing longer, as if they were closing in around me. Every step I took felt like it brought me closer to the inevitable. Tomorrow. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Tomorrow was supposed to be my last day. But was it? The night passed slowly. Every tick of the clock seemed louder than the last. I couldn't shake the sense of dread that gnawed at me, a feeling that something was just beyond my grasp, lurking in the shadows of my mind. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, but all I could think of was that final, chilling sentence in the journal, "Tomorrow, you will die." I tossed and turned, unable to find any peace. Was it a prank? A cruel joke someone had played on me? But everything in that journal, the way it described my day, the smallest details, felt too real. Too precise to be mere coincidence. What if the journal wasn't just predicting my future, but somehow controlling it? What if this was a warning, and I had no way of escaping it? The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that I needed to act. I couldn't just sit back and wait for whatever fate the journal had written for me. I needed to confront it, to do something to change my path before it was too late. As the hours crept by, I could feel the weight of the world pressing down on me. The air in my apartment seemed thick and suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I looked around the room, half expecting to see something move, but there was nothing. Everything was still, just as it had been before. But then I heard it, the faintest scratching sound, coming from somewhere above. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. The noise was so quiet, it was almost imperceptible, but it was there. Something was moving, something that shouldn't have been. My eyes darted to the ceiling, to the spot above my bed. Nothing. Just the familiar, cracked plaster. But the scratching continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was as though something was trying to claw its way through the ceiling, something just out of sight. The noise was relentless, dragging me deeper into a state of panic. My breath quickened, my hand shaking as I reached for the light switch. I flipped it on, hoping that the light would somehow chase away the darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. The scratching stopped, and I was left in the oppressive quiet. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe it was just the house settling, maybe it was my imagination running wild. But then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. It moved across the ceiling, a dark, indistinct shape that seemed to pulse with some kind of unnatural energy. My breath caught in my chest as I turned my head, desperately trying to focus on it. The shadow was strange, like it didn't belong in the world of light. It crawled along the ceiling in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Slowly, it took the shape of a hand, elongated, bony fingers stretching out toward me, as if it were reaching for something. I froze in terror, unable to look away. The hand didn't seem to have any particular direction, it just floated there, lingering above me, the fingers twitching slightly, as though they were waiting for something. Waiting for me, perhaps. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears, my breath shallow and panicked. Then, without warning, the hand vanished. The room was once again bathed in the harsh light of the lamp, the ceiling now empty. The oppressive feeling, the fear that had filled me moments before, was gone, leaving only the eerie silence behind. But I knew something had changed. Something had just shifted, and I wasn't sure if I could ever return to normal after that. I lay back down, my eyes wide and unblinking as I stared at the ceiling. Could this be happening because of the journal? Was this some sort of twisted game, a countdown that I couldn't stop? Or was it a warning, something trying to show me the consequences of my fate? I closed my eyes, but the darkness behind my eyelids was just as terrifying. I could still see that shadow in my mind, its fingers reaching down toward me. I wanted to scream, to wake up from the nightmare, but I knew this was no dream. Tomorrow. I had no choice now but to face it. Morning came too soon. The sun barely peeked through the curtains while I forced myself out of bed. I hadn't slept more than a few hours, but I couldn't waste any more time. I had to figure this out, find a way to stop whatever was going to happen. I grabbed the journal again, hoping there was something I had missed. A clue. A way to break the cycle. But when I opened it, the pages were different. They had changed. The first page still had my name on it, but the handwriting was different, as if someone else had taken over. The entries were no longer just descriptions of my day. They were instructions. Directions that seemed to control my actions. Go to the old cemetery. Don't speak to anyone. Do not run. I closed the journal, my heart racing in my chest. The entries were guiding me, telling me what I needed to do. But if I followed them, would it be my last step? Would I be walking straight into whatever fate awaited me? I didn't know, but I had no choice. I had to go. I left my apartment just as the last rays of dawn lit up the sky. The journal still gripped tightly in my hands. I felt as though I were carrying something far heavier than its pages. The weight of the unknown pressed down on me, and with every step, the feeling that I was being drawn into something inevitable grew stronger. The old cemetery was on the outskirts of town, a place I hadn't visited in years. It wasn't the kind of place people went unless they had a specific reason, and even then, the feeling of decay and loss was hard to ignore. The trees surrounding the cemetery were bare, their branches twisted like gnarled fingers reaching for the sky. The air was cold, a strange chill that seeped into my bones, making my movements feel sluggish and unnatural. I could feel the presence of something watching me, even though I couldn't see anyone. My breath came out in small, misty clouds, and each step felt like I was sinking deeper into a grave that wasn't mine to enter. The cemetery loomed ahead, its wrought iron gates creaking slightly in the wind, as if it were opening to welcome me, or perhaps to trap me inside. When I stepped inside, the ground beneath my feet was soft, almost as if it were shifting with every movement. I looked around, trying to spot anything that seemed out of place, but all I saw were the rows of gravestones, each one more withered than the last. The names etched into them were barely legible, time having worn away their meaning. The journal was no longer giving me any instructions, but it still felt heavy in my hands. I walked deeper into the cemetery, the silence wrapping itself around me like a shroud. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. There was something in the air, a sense of waiting, as though something, or someone, was just beyond my sight. Suddenly, I heard it again. That scratching noise, faint but unmistakable. It seemed to come from somewhere beneath the earth, a sound that reverberated through the ground itself. I stopped in my tracks, heart racing, eyes darting around the cemetery as I tried to pinpoint the source. The noise grew louder, more urgent, like something was trying to escape from the soil. My legs trembled, and I instinctively took a step back, my body reacting to the unseen threat. The ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse with the noise, vibrating in time with my own heartbeat. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows between two headstones. It was a woman, her face obscured by long, tangled hair. She was dressed in black, her form unsettlingly thin, as if the very air around her had drained the life from her. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to stare right through me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet refused to listen. She took a step forward, her movements jerky, as though she were being pulled against her will. The air around her seemed to thicken, and I could feel the weight of her presence pressing down on me. Her lips parted, and I could hear her whisper, though the words were indistinguishable. I looked down at the journal, hoping for some guidance, but when I opened it, the pages were blank. Not a single word was written. Panic rose in my chest as I tried to turn the pages, but they wouldn't budge. The journal had become a dead weight, useless in my hands. The woman took another step forward, her skeletal hand reaching out toward me. I could see the jagged lines of her fingers, and I instinctively stepped back. The scratching sound from beneath the earth was growing louder, almost deafening, and I could feel the ground begin to shift beneath my feet. With a gasp, I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away from her. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran blindly through the cemetery, branches of trees snapping against my face. The sound of my own footsteps was drowned out by the chaos around me, the ground shaking, the air thick with the noise of something awakening. And then I heard it. A voice, soft but unmistakable, speaking my name. Alex. I froze. The voice was coming from behind me. I turned slowly, dread filling my stomach, and found myself staring at the woman's empty eyes. Her lips were moving, her voice growing clearer with each syllable. You shouldn't have come here. Before I could react, the ground beneath me collapsed, sending me tumbling into the earth. The fall felt endless, a twisting, spiraling descent into darkness. I tried to scream, but the air was thick with dirt, choking me. When I finally hit the ground, everything went silent. I lay there for what felt like hours, my body bruised and broken, but the fear in my chest remained. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me, making me feel like I was being suffocated from all sides. I forced myself to my feet, trying to push away the panic clawing at my mind. But when I looked around, I realized I wasn't alone. The cemetery was gone. The trees, the gravestones, they were all replaced by nothing but a vast, endless void. The woman was still there, her figure standing in front of me, and I could see her face clearly now. It was my own. In the darkness, I realized the truth. I hadn't been brought here to escape fate. I had been brought here to meet it. I don't know how long I was in that void. Time seemed to lose all meaning. The ground beneath me didn't feel real, and the air was thick with something unfamiliar, almost as if it were alive, pressing in on me from all sides. It was suffocating, this emptiness, and I couldn't escape it. I tried to speak, but my voice felt muted, as if the very act of speaking was forbidden. And then, from the shadows, I saw it again, the woman, or rather, the reflection of myself. Her face was as pale as death, her eyes sunken, her lips twisted in something resembling a smile, but it wasn't mine. It was a mockery of me, as if my own image had been distorted by some unseen force. "You've been running from it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice hollow and distant, yet so unmistakably familiar. I didn't answer. How could I? What could I say to that? Her fingers, long and thin like cracked branches, reached out toward me. I stumbled back, but there was nowhere to retreat. The darkness seemed to follow me, closing in with every step. "You can't escape your own fate, Alex," she whispered, her voice echoing through the void, amplifying every word, every syllable. "You've been running, but you can't outrun the truth." The journal, my journal, flashed in my mind. The one that had shown me all the moments of my life, even the ones I hadn't experienced yet. But now, the final entry, the one that spoke of my death tomorrow, felt like an iron chain wrapped tightly around my chest. The words burned into my mind like a brand. I had come here, hadn't I? The cemetery, the book, all of it had led me here, to this inevitable moment. It wasn't just fate I was running from. It was something far darker, something I couldn't yet understand. "I won't let you die," I finally said, my voice trembling. The words felt weak, as if they had no strength to resist whatever force was pulling me under. The reflection, my reflection, tilted her head to one side, as though considering my words. "It's too late for that now." She took another step closer, and as she did, the shadows around us seemed to warp, bending and twisting into shapes that I couldn't comprehend. I could hear whispers now, voices that didn't belong to anyone, soft, indecipherable, but persistent. They swirled around me, urging me to understand, urging me to give in. "No, no, no!" I shouted, but the words felt like they were swallowed by the void. The reflection's eyes bore into mine, and I could feel the weight of my own death staring back at me. "I know how it ends, Alex," she said, her lips curling into a smile that was nothing like my own. "I know the end of your story. The journal knew it, and now you know it, too." The world around me seemed to tremble, and I felt myself falling again. But this time, it wasn't the ground that gave way. It was everything. The sky, the air, the very fabric of this place, it all began to fragment, like a shattered mirror, each piece cutting through my soul. I woke up with a gasp, back in my apartment. But everything was wrong. The room felt alien, the walls too close, the air too thin. I could still hear the whispers, still feel the suffocating weight of the void pressing down on me. My body trembled as I sat up, and the journal was still clutched tightly in my hands. But something had changed. I opened the journal, my hands shaking, and the last page, blank only moments before, was now filled with words. You cannot escape. I turned the page, frantic, but the next entry was already written. It was the same as the last, but now there was something new. Tomorrow is the day. You will not survive. I froze, staring at the words, my heart pounding in my chest. The room seemed to close in around me, the silence now unbearable. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment to come. Was this it? Was this the end? The realization hit me like a wave. The journal wasn't just a guide to my life, it was my fate. Every word, every sentence had been written before I even knew it was happening. I had tried to resist it, to fight it, but it was no use. The ending was always there, just waiting for me. And tomorrow I would face it. But what if it wasn't death that awaited me? What if it was something far worse? Would I even be able to survive whatever was coming? I closed the journal, the words burning in my mind. The room grew darker, colder. I could feel the presence again, that suffocating feeling of being watched, of something lurking in the corners of my mind. Tomorrow. The whispers started again, growing louder this time. And I realized with a sickening certainty that no matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried to change it, tomorrow would come. And when it did, the truth would be revealed. And I would have no choice but to face it. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The journal sat on the table, its presence undeniable, like a ticking clock I could neither ignore nor escape. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the whispers crawling into my mind, promising a fate that was already written, a truth that could no longer be denied. The hours dragged by, each minute stretching longer than the last. The night grew colder, and despite my best efforts, I could feel the darkness creeping closer. It wasn't just outside, no, it was inside, a presence I couldn't shake, a weight I couldn't escape. The journal, with its last chilling words, burned into my thoughts, replaying over and over like an unstoppable loop. Tomorrow is the day. You will not survive. I couldn't stop reading it. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to distract myself, watching the clock tick down, pacing the room, but nothing helped. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow, and I felt them pressing in on me, like they were waiting for the moment to strike. By the time the first rays of dawn filtered through the blinds, I was standing at the window, staring out at the quiet, empty streets. There was no sign of the world falling apart. No sudden calamity. It was all normal. And yet, it wasn't. Not for me. I glanced at the journal, which had been sitting innocently on the table, as though it held no more power than a piece of paper. But I knew better. I knew it had already written my fate. There was no escape from it. But what if the ending hadn't been written yet? What if I could change it? The thought clung to me, desperate, like a lifeline I didn't believe in but had to hold on to. I grabbed the journal and flipped it open. The last entry, still haunting, was staring back at me. I traced my fingers along the words, the cold ink somehow sending a shock through my fingertips. Tomorrow is the day. You will not survive. I slammed the book shut, my chest tightening. There had to be something I could do. There had to be a way to stop it. But what if there wasn't? What if tomorrow had already been decided, written in stone, like every other moment in my life? Then I heard it. A low, persistent scratching sound. It started softly at first, so faint I thought it might be the wind against the window. But it grew louder, closer. I could feel it vibrating through the floorboards, as though something, or someone, was crawling toward me. The sound was unnatural, harsh, like fingernails scraping against wood. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat. The room seemed to bend with the noise, warping, distorting. My breath came in ragged gasps as I moved toward the source of the sound, the wall behind the bookshelf. And then, I saw it. A crack had appeared in the wall, splitting wide open like the earth had been torn apart. From within the crack, a shadow moved. At first, it was only a glimpse, just the shape of something dark and indistinct. But then, it took form. A hand. Pale, skeletal, fingers elongated and claw-like, emerging from the darkness within the wall. The scratching sound grew louder, frantic, like something trying to claw its way through. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. The air in the room grew thick, suffocating. I could hardly breathe. I reached for the journal, the weight of it still heavy in my hands. But as soon as I touched it, the shadows grew thicker, swirling around me. I couldn't escape. My body was frozen, paralyzed with fear, as if the very room had turned against me. The hand emerged fully now, dragging itself from the crack in the wall, its fingers long and twisted. It reached for me, a grip of death, and the room seemed to darken further, as if it were feeding on the light. I wanted to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the suffocating darkness. The hand grasped my wrist with an icy, unyielding grip. I felt my body being pulled toward the crack in the wall, toward the dark void beyond. I tried to fight it, tried to pull away, but it was no use. The more I struggled, the tighter its grip became. The whispers started again, louder now, more urgent. They filled my mind, drowning out everything else. There was no escape. The journal's words echoed in my head, "You will not survive." The darkness around me began to close in, but then, just as I thought I would be swallowed whole, something snapped inside me. I didn't know what it was, a final spark of defiance, perhaps. But I forced myself to fight back. With all my strength, I wrenched my wrist free from the hand's grip, the force sending me stumbling backward. The shadows recoiled, as if they hadn't expected me to fight. I reached for the journal again, desperate. The last entry was still there, waiting. Still reading. "You will not survive." And then it hit me. The journal wasn't controlling me. I was controlling it. The words, the events, they weren't written in stone. They were written by me. I was the one who had been writing my own fate. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't undo what had already happened. But I could change the present, the now. I opened the journal again, this time to the last page. My pen shook in my hand as I scribbled the words. "I will survive." And for the first time since I'd found the journal, I felt the room shift. The darkness receded, the air became lighter. The oppressive weight lifted, and the hand that had grasped me pulled back into the void. The journal's pages began to turn, not of their own accord, but as though they were accepting what I had written. I stared at the page, unsure if it had truly worked, but the whispers had stopped. The air was still. It wasn't over. I knew that. But for the first time, I felt a sliver of hope. I had written my own ending, and that was enough. Have you ever walked the same path so many times that you thought you knew every inch of it? The familiar rhythm of your steps, the landmarks, the streetlights blinking in the same order, everything in its place, just as it should be. That's how it had always been for me. My morning commute was predictable, a dull repetition I'd grown comfortable with. But then, one morning, something changed. It was the kind of change that didn't announce itself in any grand way, not like a loud crash or a burst of lightning. No, this change was subtle, like the first hint of rain in the air before the storm arrives. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd immediately notice, but when you did, it made you feel uneasy. It started with the stairs. I was walking to work as usual, past the old bookstore on the corner, past the bakery with the warm smell of fresh bread walking through the door, and then, out of nowhere, I saw them. Stairs. They weren't there yesterday. I was sure of it. They were located just a few feet away from the alley I always passed. They were narrow and old, the wooden steps worn from years of use, leading down into darkness. The entrance was hidden behind an iron gate that I had never noticed before, standing silently as if it had always been there. But today, it was open. The door creaked ever so slightly, inviting me in. I stopped in my tracks, my heart picking up its pace. Something in my gut told me to turn around, to walk away. After all, I had no reason to investigate these stairs, no reason to go down there. But curiosity is a strange thing. It grabs you when you least expect it, dragging you toward the unknown. And before I could talk myself out of it, my feet were moving toward the stairs. The closer I got, the more uncomfortable I felt. The air around me seemed heavier, thicker, as though something was pressing down on me. I glanced around. No one was in sight. The street, usually so full of life at this hour, was eerily quiet. The hum of traffic, the distant chatter of people, the usual soundtrack of the city, all faded into a dull, unsettling silence. I took another step. The stairs creaked beneath my weight, the sound echoing in the stillness. There was something wrong about them, but I couldn't place it. The deeper I descended, the darker it got. The light from the street lamps above dimmed as if reluctant to follow me into the depths. The steps were narrow, the wooden railings cold to the touch, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. And yet, I couldn't stop myself. I kept going. By the time I reached the bottom, I was fully engulfed in darkness. The stairs seemed endless, stretching down further than I had anticipated. My phone's flashlight barely pierced the blackness, its weak beam flickering as I shone it around. The walls were made of rough stone, damp to the touch. I wiped my hand on my pants, shuddering from the cold. I expected to find a basement or an old storage area, perhaps a forgotten passageway. But instead, I found a small door, half open, with faint light seeping through the cracks. It was like the door was waiting for me to approach, beckoning me forward. I shouldn't have gone any further. I should have turned around then, walked back up those stairs, and never looked back. But the door, it called to me. I don't know why, but I felt as though I had no choice. I reached for the doorknob, and for a split second, I hesitated. The air felt colder now, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I should have felt terrified, but instead, I felt drawn in. As if something, or someone, was urging me to step through. My fingers wrapped around the knob. It was warm. Too warm. Without thinking, I twisted it and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, though the source of the light was nowhere to be found. Shadows clung to the walls like a living thing, moving with the flicker of the light. The space was larger than I had imagined, stretching out into a vast, open area that seemed to have no clear boundaries. I couldn't see the edges, couldn't make out the corners. Then I heard it. A low, faint sound, barely perceptible at first, but then growing louder, clearer. A sound like footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps echoing through the room. They were coming closer. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My pulse raced as I stood there in the dark, the air thick with tension. The footsteps stopped. I waited, my heart thudding in my chest. And then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The light flickered again, and for just a brief moment, I saw it. A figure. In the far corner of the room, standing still, watching me. It was tall, impossibly tall, its features obscured by shadows. I could barely make out the outline, but I knew it was staring at me. And then, slowly, it moved. I stumbled backward, panic setting in as I searched for any way out. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. The room seemed to stretch and shift, its dimensions warping with every breath I took. The footsteps began again, this time louder, faster. The figure was coming closer. I had to get out. But no matter where I turned, the path back to the stairs, the path I thought I had come from, was gone. I had been led down here. And now, there was no way out. The walls seemed to breathe with me, expanding and contracting as though they were alive. My pulse raced, my breath quickening with every passing second. I turned around, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of a way out. The figure had not moved, but its presence felt like a weight pressing against me, suffocating me from all sides. I stumbled backward, my hands reaching out blindly for something, anything, solid to cling to. The air around me felt thick, almost viscous, as if it were alive itself. The door was gone, vanished into the walls, leaving nothing but cold stone where it once was. Panic rose in my chest. My heart pounded so loudly, I feared it might burst from my chest. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. The footsteps were louder now. Rapid, almost frantic. The sound echoed through the space, bouncing off the walls and filling the room with a chaotic rhythm. I spun around, disoriented, trying to find any sign of the figure I had seen. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam cutting through the shadows like a knife through fog, but I could see nothing clearly. The footsteps came closer, faster, until they were right behind me. I whipped around, my flashlight aimed in the direction of the sound, but I saw nothing. No figure. No movement. Just the empty air and the oppressive darkness. But I felt it. A presence. Behind me. Watching me. I snapped my head back, my eyes wide in fear. The darkness felt like it was closing in on me. The air grew heavier, colder. My chest tightened as I struggled to take in a breath. The shadows seemed to pulse, growing, shifting as though they had a life of their own. I tried to move, to step toward what I thought was the exit, but my legs felt like they were made of stone. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, like invisible hands were holding me in place. The darkness swirled around me, and I could feel something brushing against my skin, cold, clammy fingers that I couldn't see but could feel, sending a chill up my spine. Then, a voice. It was low, almost a whisper, but it echoed in the silence. It was a voice I didn't recognize, yet somehow, it felt familiar. It felt like it was speaking directly to me, its words crawling into my mind, whispering something I couldn't quite understand. Come closer. I couldn't tell if the voice was inside my head or coming from the shadows themselves. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get out, but I couldn't. The air was thick, suffocating, and my legs refused to move. The darkness around me seemed to reach out, pulling me in. Come closer, or it will take you. I didn't know who or what it was, but the terror in my chest grew as I realized I had no choice. There was nowhere to go. No way back. The footsteps stopped. For a brief moment, there was silence. The oppressive weight of the room lifted just enough for me to think, to regain a shred of clarity. I took a deep breath, willing myself to calm down, to think. I had to find a way out. I turned in a circle, scanning the space for any exit, but the room seemed to stretch on endlessly, the walls bending and shifting in impossible ways. Every time I thought I saw a way out, it disappeared before I could move toward it. And then, as if responding to my desperation, the figure appeared again. It was tall, towering, its shape shifting with the darkness, its outline barely visible. It stepped forward, its movements slow but deliberate. The shadows clung to it like a cloak, distorting its form, making it impossible to see it clearly. It spoke again, its voice deep and resonant, vibrating through the air. You're not meant to leave. I froze. My blood ran cold. The words seemed to echo through the very core of me, settling deep in my bones. There was no way out. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I had been trapped. I had fallen into a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. The figure took another step closer, and I could feel its presence growing stronger, overwhelming my senses. My breath quickened again, panic surging through me. I had to move. I had to escape. But my legs refused to obey. I was paralyzed, unable to take another step. The figure raised its hand, and I saw a glimmer of something, a dark, glistening object in its grasp. It was a key. Or at least, it resembled one. But it wasn't just any key. This one pulsed with an unnatural energy, a dark aura that made the air itself vibrate with tension. The figure held the key out to me, its face still hidden in the shadows. Take it, it whispered, the voice dripping with malice. Take the key, and it will be yours to keep. I stared at the key, my body trembling, unsure of what to do. The room seemed to close in on me even more. I could feel the weight of the figure's gaze on me, the pressure building as though I were being crushed from all sides. I didn't want to take it. I didn't want anything from this place, this nightmare. But I felt drawn to the key, as though it held the answers I so desperately needed. But what would happen if I took it? What was it that I would unlock? Suddenly, the key moved closer, almost as if it was being pushed toward me. Without thinking, I reached out for it, my hand trembling. The moment my fingers brushed the cool metal, the room shifted. I gasped as the walls began to warp and twist, the shadows stretching and swirling around me like a living thing. The darkness seemed to collapse inward, pulling me into its depths. The footsteps began again, louder this time, like a drumbeat growing ever closer, growing louder with each passing second. Something was coming. Something worse than a figure. Something that had been waiting. I had no choice but to take the key. And in doing so, I had sealed my fate. The moment I touched the key, the world around me shattered. The floor beneath my feet gave way, the walls distorting, stretching until they blurred into the void. I felt my body being pulled, dragged through the very fabric of reality, the key now cold and unyielding in my hand. The sound of my pulse pounded in my ears, drowning out all other noises as the ground seemed to fall away beneath me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight it, but no sound left my throat. The shadows seemed to consume everything, swallowing the light, pulling me deeper into the unknown. I couldn't see anything clearly. My eyes strained against the darkness, but it was as though I were sinking into an endless abyss. I braced myself for the impact I knew was coming. The sense of falling was unbearable. I had no idea how far I had fallen or how long it lasted, but suddenly it stopped. The world halted, as if frozen in time. The air was still, heavy with an unnatural silence. I opened my eyes. I was standing on solid ground, but it was unlike anything I had ever seen. The floor was made of stone, smooth and cold to the touch, covered with cracks that seemed to pulse with an eerie light. The shadows here were thick, like they had weight, curling around the walls and the floor in unnatural patterns. The atmosphere felt wrong, like I was in a place that didn't belong, neither here nor there. I looked around. The space was vast, stretching endlessly in every direction. There were no windows, no doors. Just an oppressive, suffocating silence. A faint, distant sound reached my ears, whispers, though I couldn't make out the words. I strained to listen, my heart racing again, but the whispers faded before I could catch them. They were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I took a step forward, my breath shallow and quick, feeling the weight of the key in my hand. Its dark energy seemed to seep into my skin, filling my veins with a cold, heavy sensation. I had made a choice I couldn't take back. And now, I was here, in this strange, labyrinthine place, with no way of knowing how to escape. A chill ran through me, and I glanced over my shoulder. The figure that had given me the key was gone, but I could feel its presence lingering in the air, watching me, waiting. I shuddered, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but I didn't know where to go. There were no clear paths, no signs of anything familiar. Only endless darkness. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. Not the hurried kind I had heard before, but slow, deliberate, echoing through the empty space. They grew louder with every passing second, drawing closer, and the air seemed to grow colder, heavier. I turned around, my breath caught in my throat. A figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't the same one I had seen earlier, but it shared the same oppressive presence. This new figure was different. Taller, more angular, its body draped in tattered robes that seemed to float around it. The face was obscured by a hood, but its eyes glowed, piercing through the darkness like twin beacons of malice. The figure stopped a few feet away from me, its gaze fixed on the key in my hand. I could feel the weight of its stare, a palpable force that pressed against my skin. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, waiting. I swallowed hard. My hand gripped the key tighter, though it did nothing to comfort me. The figure made no effort to advance, but I could feel the tension rising. Something in the air shifted, a palpable sense of threat hanging between us. I wanted to say something, to demand answers, but my voice failed me. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. I took another step back, but the figure didn't react. It just stood there, unblinking, staring. And then, finally, it spoke. Its voice was soft at first, almost like a whisper, but it carried an undeniable weight. "You should not have taken the key." I froze. The words sent a shiver down my spine. How did it know? How could it know? I didn't have a choice, I managed to say, my voice shaky. It was offered to me. The figure's head tilted slightly, its eyes narrowing. "Choices are not always as free as they seem," it replied. "Now, you must face the consequences." The ground beneath me seemed to tremble, and the shadows deepened. The air grew colder still, biting at my skin. I could feel something shifting, something watching from just beyond the edges of my vision. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Where am I? What is this place?" The figure raised its hand, and the shadows around us began to swirl, twisting in unnatural patterns. The air hummed with a strange energy, and the room, if it could be called that, seemed to pulse, breathing with the figure's movements. "This is the space between worlds," it said, its voice almost a growl now. "A place where those who take what is not meant for them are trapped. And you, my friend, are now one of them." I felt a sinking feeling in my chest, the weight of its words crashing over me. I was trapped. There was no way out. The figure stepped closer, and the shadows around it seemed to shift, almost alive, as though they were part of the creature itself. "You are not the first to enter this place," it said, its voice growing darker. "Nor will you be the last. But you may be the first to survive. The key you hold opens more than you realize, and what lies ahead is far worse than what you've already faced." It stepped back, disappearing into the shadows, leaving me with only the key and the growing sense of dread that clung to every inch of this place. I had to survive. I had to find a way out. But the deeper I ventured, the more I realized that this wasn't just about escape. This was about understanding what I had unleashed, and how far I was willing to go to stop it. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, still trying to process the figure's words. My breath was shallow, each inhale feeling like a desperate attempt to hold on to reality as everything around me seemed to warp and twist. The shadows continued to pulse and shift, but the figure was gone, leaving only its chilling presence hanging in the air. I looked down at the key still gripped tightly in my hand. It felt heavier now, its dark energy growing more oppressive. The walls seemed to move in response to its touch, the cracks in the stone walls widening and contracting, as though breathing along with me. I could no longer tell where the floor ended and the walls began. The lines between reality and nightmare were blurring, becoming indistinct. The whispers began again. This time, they weren't faint, they were clear, close, as though the shadows themselves were speaking to me. The words were garbled, indecipherable at first, but there was a sense of urgency in their tone. I had to move. I couldn't stay here, waiting for whatever it was that lurked in the dark to find me. The air felt thick, as if something was slowly suffocating the space, pulling the life out of it. The key burned in my hand, urging me forward. Despite every fiber of my being screaming to turn back, I forced myself to take a step. The maze ahead of me stretched endlessly. The walls were not solid, but seemed to shift, constantly changing, twisting and turning into new pathways with each glance. No matter which direction I looked, the path ahead seemed to lead nowhere, and I couldn't remember the way I came. I tried to call out, but no sound left my mouth. It was as though my voice had been swallowed by the very air around me. The weight of silence pressed down on me, suffocating, making my skin prickle with unease. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like voices just beyond the reach of my understanding. I walked forward, unsure of where I was going, but driven by a primal need to escape. The key in my hand hummed with energy, a low vibration that resonated with the very core of my being. As I moved deeper into the maze, I noticed strange markings etched into the walls. Symbols I didn't recognize, some of them pulsating with the same eerie glow that seemed to radiate from the key. I had to find an answer, a way out. My mind raced as I thought about the figure's words, "You may be the first to survive." What did that mean? Was I meant to be some kind of sacrifice, or was there a way for me to escape this nightmare? I had no idea, but I couldn't just give up. I had to keep moving, keep looking for something, anything that could make sense of what was happening. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The whispers were now joined by low growls, echoing through the maze. I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting, but whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. Only the shifting shadows, stretching and growing in the dim light, teasing me with their movement. I reached a fork in the path and hesitated. The right path was dark, almost completely void of light, while the left path was illuminated by a faint, flickering glow. The glow felt warm, inviting, like it could offer some semblance of safety. But something told me it was a trap. I didn't know how long I stood there, torn between the two paths, before something shifted. A low rumble reverberated through the ground, followed by a strange, echoing sound, like footsteps, but too slow, too deliberate. My blood ran cold, and I knew then that I was not alone. I turned toward the dark path. The air around me grew colder as I took the first step into the darkness, my footfall muffled by the thick layer of dust that covered the floor. I could hear the sound of the growls again, louder now, more distinct. It was like they were coming from all directions, pressing in from the shadows. The light from the key flickered, casting long, twisted shadows along the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, though I never saw it. Every corner I turned, every new twist in the maze, seemed to pull me deeper into the unknown. Suddenly, I stumbled into an open space. The chamber was vast, its ceiling stretching so high it seemed to disappear into nothing. The walls were lined with more of those strange symbols, and at the center of the room stood a pedestal, crowned by a large stone sphere. The sphere was covered in runes, glowing faintly in the dim light. It looked ancient, too ancient for this place. I approached it slowly, my hand still gripping the key. As I reached out to touch the sphere, a voice suddenly filled the air. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was cold, echoing off the walls. I froze, my hand inches from the stone. My heart pounded in my chest, and I whipped around, but there was no one there. "You don't belong here," the voice continued. "The path you took was never meant to be walked." I took a step back, looking frantically for the source of the voice, but the room remained empty, eerily still. The only movement was the shifting glow of the runes on the stone, like they were alive. "You are not the first to try," the voice whispered, barely audible, "and you will not be the last." Suddenly, the pedestal shook, the sphere vibrating with an unnatural force. The key in my hand grew colder, and I felt a sharp, unexplainable pain in my chest. Something was happening, something I couldn't control. The ground beneath me cracked, and a deep, rumbling sound filled the chamber. I had to make a choice. I could leave the sphere alone and retreat into the maze, or I could touch it and face whatever was about to unfold. But what if this was the only way out? What if this was the key to escaping this nightmare? I reached for it. As my fingers brushed the cold, jagged surface of the sphere, a violent tremor shot through the room, and a deafening roar filled my ears. The walls around me cracked, and dust poured down from the ceiling, blurring my vision. For a split second, I wondered if this was it, if I was about to be swallowed by the very place I had wandered into. But then everything stopped. The trembling ceased, the roar faded, and the dust settled. I stood motionless, hands still resting on the stone, my heart racing. It was as if time itself had frozen. I glanced around. The chamber, once filled with an oppressive weight, now felt eerily calm. But there was something different. The runes on the sphere pulsed with a rhythmic glow, brighter than before, and the air around me seemed to hum with an energy I couldn't describe. A low whisper echoed in my mind, like a distant call, beckoning me to look closer, to understand. I took a deep breath and leaned in, trying to make sense of the strange sensations flooding my body. The whispers grew louder, clearer, until the words were unmistakable. You cannot go back. My stomach churned. The voice felt so familiar, as if it was something I had always known but never truly understood. What was this place? What did it want from me? Before I could process the thought, the sphere began to crack open, lines running through its surface like spider webs. My pulse quickened as the crack widened, revealing a glowing core within. The light it emitted was blinding, and I had to shield my eyes, but even through the burn, I couldn't look away. It was then that I heard the sound, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps echoing in the chamber behind me. My head snapped toward the entrance, my body tense, every instinct screaming at me to run. But there was nowhere to go. The path behind me was sealed, just as I had feared. The maze was alive, and it had already closed off the way out. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could feel the weight of them pressing on my chest, the suffocating realization that something was coming for me. And it wasn't just the dark force in the maze, it was something much more ancient, more powerful. I had to make my decision. The sphere's core pulsed again, its light flickering in time with my racing heartbeat. If I touched it now, I felt an almost overwhelming sense of urgency. It was like a doorway opening before me, a chance to escape the labyrinth. But I didn't know what lay beyond it. Was this the escape I had been searching for? Or was it a trap, an irreversible choice that would plunge me deeper into this nightmare? And what of the footsteps behind me? Whoever, or whatever, was coming, I had no doubt they weren't friendly. I could feel the key still in my hand, cold and unyielding. It burned with energy, urging me toward the sphere. The darkness around me seemed to press in even harder, suffocating me. The footsteps were so close now. I had no time left. The figure, or whatever it was mere seconds away from reaching me. I made my choice. With a trembling hand, I pressed my palm firmly against the sphere's glowing core. The moment my skin touched the light, a surge of energy exploded through me. The world around me shattered, fragments of stone and shadow swirling like a storm. My body jerked, as if being pulled in every direction at once. The air turned to ice, biting into my skin, but it was as if I couldn't feel it. I was suspended in a vacuum, caught between two worlds. And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the chamber. I wasn't even sure where I was. My surroundings were completely unfamiliar, a dark, endless space stretching beyond the reach of my sight. I stood on solid ground, but it felt unstable, like the very foundation of reality was shaking beneath me. I took a step forward, and the darkness shifted, rippling like water disturbed by a stone. The air smelled different, colder, and I could hear voices. They echoed around me, familiar yet distorted, as if coming from a place far beyond my reach. Each whisper twisted and warped in my mind, forming no coherent words, only fragments of memories I didn't recognize. Was I still alive? Was this what I had chosen? Or had I crossed into some other realm, some place between life and death? I didn't know. I turned around, searching for any sign of the path I had come from, but there was nothing. The maze, the pedestal, the sphere, all of it was gone. In its place was an infinite expanse of darkness, endless and consuming. I could feel it press in on me, threatening to swallow me whole. And then I heard it. A voice. A voice I knew. Welcome. It was low and smooth, carrying an unsettling calmness. My blood ran cold as I recognized it. It was the voice I had heard in the maze. The one that had whispered in my mind. The one that had warned me, "You cannot go back." I wasn't sure where it was coming from, whether from the darkness itself or from within me. But it didn't matter. The words echoed in my head, growing louder, sharper, until they drowned out everything else. You cannot go back. I had chosen this path, and now I had to face the consequences. And as I stood there, alone in the endless void, I realized the truth. I was never meant to escape. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.